All dinosaurs were huge. You know how in movies and TV shows, dinosaurs are always these massive, skyscraper-sized monsters stomping around like the ultimate kings of their world? You're probably imagining a scene straight out of Jurassic Park. T-Rex towering over everything, a Brachiosaurus with its neck reaching the clouds, Triceratops crashing through forests like some kind of armored bulldozer. It's thrilling, it's terrifying, and it's mostly wrong. Yup, brace yourself, not all dinosaurs were giant. In fact, a lot of them were the size of your dog, or even smaller. Some could probably fit in your backpack if you had tried hard enough. Let's start with the obvious. When people hear the word dinosaur, their brains automatically picture something colossal. And hey, it's not totally their fault. The media, museums, and even old textbooks tended to focus on the giants because, well, giant things are impressive. But dinosaurs were a wildly diverse group. We're talking over 1,000 confirmed species, and probably thousands more that haven't been discovered yet. Their sizes ranged from tiny feathered creatures no bigger than a pigeon to the absolute titans, like Argentinosaurus, which may have weighed over 100 tons. That's a 100-ton lizard. But here's the kicker. Most dinosaurs were small to medium-sized, not earth-shaking giants. Take, for example, Microraptor, a tiny feathered dinosaur from China. This tiny predator was roughly the size of a crow with 4 wings and a long feathery tail. Yeah, you read that right, 4 wings. It probably glided between trees like some kind of Jurassic flying ninja. Or consider Compsognathus, a dinosaur that might remind you of a skinny chicken. It was only about 3 feet long, and it probably hunted insects or small lizards. Imagine thinking of dinosaurs as giant beasts and then realizing one of them could comfortably sit on your lap while you watch Netflix. Mind blown, right? But here's why this misconception matters. People tend to think of dinosaur and giant as synonymous, which has shaped the way we visualize the prehistoric world. We imagine forests dominated by skyscraper-sized creatures, with tiny mammals scuttling in the shadows. In reality, smaller dinosaurs were abundant and played crucial roles in their ecosystems. They were agile, fast, and in some cases, surprisingly clever. Picture a tiny predator darting between the legs of a lumbering sauropod, snatching insects or hunting other small animals. That's a world where size wasn't everything. Speed, cunning, and adaptability were just as important. So why do we still get it wrong? Part of the issue is preservation bias. Bigger bones are more likely to fossilize and survive millions of years. Tiny dinosaur bones, on the other hand, are fragile, easily crushed, and less likely to be discovered. Early paleontologists found enormous bones and naturally assumed those were the norm. Smaller species were often overlooked. It's only in recent decades, with more careful excavation techniques and microfossil studies, that scientists started to uncover a whole menagerie of pint-sized dinosaurs hiding in the rock record. Now, here's a fun thought experiment. Imagine a city street filled with dinosaurs, but not the giant, terrifying ones. Instead, the majority are pocket-sized or slightly bigger. You've got little feathered dinosaurs hopping along the curb, scuttling around traffic cones, and maybe even glancing at you like, "Yep, we're dinosaurs, and no, we're not big enough to eat you. It's ridiculous, hilarious, and oddly adorable. But that's closer to reality than the Godzilla-style visions most of us carry in our heads. And yes, size in dinosaurs was highly varied, even within the same group. Take theropods, the classic meat eaters. You have the colossal Tyrannosaurus rex, sure, but also the tiny velociraptor, which, contrary to Hollywood depictions, was about the size of a turkey. Or look at sauropods. The massive Argentinosaurus might have towered over everything, but there were smaller relatives that weren't much bigger than a large cow. Dinosaurs evolved into every conceivable size niche, from tiny forest-dwelling hunters to massive long-necked browsers. It's one of the things that makes them so fascinating. They didn't stick to a single formula. Another interesting point is that small size wasn't a disadvantage. Smaller dinosaurs often had feathers, which could help with temperature regulation, camouflage, or even gliding. Being small also made them fast and maneuverable, able to escape predators, hunt elusive prey, or squeeze into tight spaces. Meanwhile, giant dinosaurs had their own challenges: immense weight, slower speeds, and enormous food requirements. Each size brought trade-offs, and nature found a way to make them all work. So next time you think dinosaur, try to picture the full spectrum. Don't just imagine a towering T-Rex or a long-necked Brachiosaurus. Remember the Microraptors, the Compsognathus, the small feathered hunters darting through underbrush. The prehistoric world was a chaotic, vibrant place, with creatures of all shapes and sizes interacting in ways that were just as exciting as what we see on the big screen, sometimes even more so, because they weren't all slow-motion monsters with roaring soundtracks. And here's a little challenge for you. The next time you visit a museum or watch a dinosaur documentary, keep an eye out for the tiny ones. They might be easy to miss, but they're just as important, just as fascinating, and in many ways, even more relatable. After all, it is kind of fun to imagine a feathered dinosaur hopping across your backyard instead of stomping through your house. It makes the prehistoric world a little closer, a little more real, and a lot more diverse. So yeah, dinosaurs weren't all huge, scary, skyscraper-sized monsters. Many of them were small, clever, fast, and surprisingly adorable. Their diversity is mind-blowing, and the myth of all dinosaurs were giant is one of the oldest and most persistent misconceptions in paleontology. Next time someone says dinosaurs were enormous, you can nod, smile, and think of the little tiny Microraptor gliding past, proving that size isn't everything, even in the world of dinosaurs.
Tyrannosaurus rex was slow. When you picture a T-Rex, what comes to mind? Chances are you're imagining a hulking, lumbering beast dragging its massive legs through a prehistoric forest, barely keeping up with anything smaller than itself. Movies, cartoons, and even some old textbooks painted T-Rex as a slow-motion predator, more like a giant garbage disposal than a top-notch hunter. But here's the truth that might just blow your mind. T-Rex was probably a lot faster and way more agile than we used to think. First off, let's get a sense of scale. Tyrannosaurus rex wasn't just big, it was enormous. Fully grown, it could reach lengths of 40 feet, weigh around 7 tons, and had a skull that alone could be the size of a small car. That's intimidating enough, right? With a body that massive, it's easy to see why people assumed it couldn't move very fast. After all, even elephants don't sprint at highway speeds. But here's the thing. T-Rex wasn't just a pile of muscle and bone, it was a finely tuned predator. And nature doesn't design a 7-ton animal to be completely clumsy if it has to survive. So where did this idea of a slow T-Rex come from? Early paleontologists studied its massive legs and huge body and assumed physics must limit its speed. They imagined T-Rex lumbering along at maybe 10 miles per hour, like a slow jog that even a human could outrun. And for a long time, that made sense, until researchers started looking more closely at its leg structure, muscle attachments, and footprints. What they found changed everything. One of the biggest clues comes from fossilized leg bones. The length and shape of the femur and tibia suggest that T-Rex had long, strong legs designed for stride and speed. Scientists use models to estimate how fast it could move based on these bones. And surprisingly, the numbers weren't tiny. Estimates suggest a top speed somewhere between 20 and 25 miles per hour. Sure, that's not Olympic sprinter speed, but remember, this is a 7-ton predator running that fast. Imagine a creature heavier than a small truck charging at 25 miles per hour. That's terrifying. And here's a fun mental exercise. If you're jogging at 6 miles per hour, you could theoretically get out of the way, but you'd better start sprinting fast because T-Rex was built to chase prey with efficiency in mind. Another piece of evidence comes from footprints. Paleontologists have found fossilized tracks that give clues about stride length and walking mechanics. These footprints show T-Rex didn't drag its feet or shuffle slowly. It lifted its legs, walked with a natural gait, and had a stride optimized for movement. It's like it had a built-in predator mode switch, slow when surveying its territory, fast when chasing lunch. And those enormous tail muscles, not just for show, they acted as a counterbalance, allowing T-Rex to accelerate and turn more quickly than you might expect for a creature of its size. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Some researchers argue that T-Rex didn't need to be a marathon sprinter. Its prey, creatures like Triceratops or Edmontosaurus, were also huge and not exactly built for sprinting. So T-Rex's speed was probably perfectly matched to its hunting strategy, fast enough to ambush or chase down large prey, but also strong enough to wrestle or overpower them once it got close. Think of it less like a cheetah chasing gazelles and more like a heavyweight wrestler planning the perfect takedown. Its combination of speed, power, and bite force made it one of the most efficient predators of its time. Speaking of bite force, T-Rex had a jaw that could crush bone. But even with that kind of weapon, it needed speed to catch prey before it could escape. And here's a fun detail. Studies of its muscles suggest it had surprisingly fast twitch fibers in its legs, which means it could burst into quick sprints or lunge at prey with explosive power. Not bad for a giant, right? Let's also bust a movie myth while we're at it. Hollywood often portrays T-Rex as a slow, lumbering monster, only suddenly running when someone trips over a rock. Reality? It likely didn't need to tiptoe around forests. It could move deliberately, with purpose, and then accelerate when necessary. And if it did give chase, it could have caught up to prey in a few seconds flat. Picture being a Triceratops, grazing peacefully, and suddenly noticing that 25-mile-per-hour shadow charging your way. Yeah, I'd be running too. Now I know what you're thinking. You're probably saying, wait, a 7-ton dinosaur running 25 miles per hour? Isn't that physically impossible? It's a fair question. Some scientists argue that the largest T-Rex adults may have been a bit slower due to sheer weight, while younger or smaller adults could reach the higher estimates. So yes, the biggest ones might not have been Olympic sprinters, but even at a slightly slower pace, their speed was impressive enough to catch most prey. And considering that most hunting was probably a mix of stalking, ambushing, and short bursts of speed, T-Rex was perfectly adapted to its environment. Here's a fun way to imagine it. Picture a city street, but instead of cars, you have a T-Rex. You're walking your dog, minding your business, when a T-Rex suddenly appears.
You might think, no problem, I can outrun it. But remember, this thing could accelerate faster than you, has a stride that covers more ground than your longest step, and a tail for balance that lets it pivot mid-chase. In real life, your dog probably wouldn't even see it coming. That's the kind of predator we're talking about. Not slow, not lazy, but efficient, terrifying, and surprisingly fast. And there's one more twist. Speed isn't everything when it comes to survival. T-Rex combined speed with intelligence and strategy. It had excellent binocular vision, keen senses, and massive muscles designed for ambush attacks. So even if it couldn't sprint all day like a marathon runner, it didn't need to. It was perfectly suited to its role in the ecosystem, dominating as an apex predator in a world of giants. So the next time you watch a T-Rex lumber across the screen in slow motion, remember, it's probably not how it happened in real life. T-Rex was far faster, smarter, and deadlier than Hollywood lets on. Movies might exaggerate its size or ferocity for drama, but the truth is just as amazing, and maybe a little scarier. Imagine a 7-ton predator capable of short bursts of 25 miles per hour, striking with precision and crushing bones with its bite. That's a real-life T-Rex, built for power, speed, and survival. In conclusion, the myth that T-Rex was slow is just that, a myth. Thanks to fossil evidence, biomechanical studies, and careful analysis of leg bones and footprints, we now know this predator could move much faster than previously imagined. It wasn't a clumsy giant. It was a terrifyingly efficient hunter, perfectly suited to the late Cretaceous world it ruled. So the next time you see a T-Rex lumber across the screen in slow motion, remember, it's probably not how it happened in real life. T-Rex was far faster, smarter, and deadlier than Hollywood lets on. Movies might exaggerate its size or ferocity for drama, but the truth is just as amazing and maybe a little scarier. Imagine a 7-ton predator capable of short bursts of 25 miles per hour, striking with precision and crushing bones with its bite. That's a real-life T-Rex, built for power, speed, and survival. In conclusion, the myth that T-Rex was slow is just that, a myth. Thanks to fossil evidence, biomechanical studies, and careful analysis of leg bones and footprints, we now know this predator could move much faster than previously imagined. It wasn't a clumsy giant. It was a terrifyingly efficient hunter, perfectly suited to the late Cretaceous world it ruled. So the next time you see a slow-motion T-Rex in a movie, just imagine it running at 25 miles an hour and think, yeah, that's probably closer to reality. And maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't want to be in its path.
Dinosaurs were cold-blooded. All right, let's settle something right off the bat. Dinosaurs were not just oversized lizards sunbathing on rocks to warm up. That's the classic image that's been drilled into people for decades. You know the scene. Lizards sprawled in the sun, sluggish and slow, barely moving unless it's time to eat or escape a predator. For a long time, scientists assumed dinosaurs were basically the same, cold-blooded reptiles needing the sun to get their energy. But here's the twist. That idea is mostly outdated. Many dinosaurs were likely warm-blooded, or at least something in between, and that changes the way we think about their behavior, hunting, and daily life. First, let's unpack what cold-blooded actually means. Cold-blooded animals like modern lizards and snakes rely heavily on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature. This makes them sluggish when it's cool and active only when they've warmed up. Warm-blooded animals, like birds and mammals, generate their own heat internally, which means they can stay active regardless of the weather. If dinosaurs were cold-blooded, they would have been limited in their movements, hunting times, and habitats. They'd be slow in the morning, taking hours to warm up before going on a hunt, and they'd struggle in cooler climates. But here's the thing. Dinosaur fossils tell a very different story. Bones, footprints, and even the way their bodies were built suggest that many dinosaurs were far more active than cold-blooded creatures. For example, look at theropods, the group that includes T-Rex and Velociraptor. These were predators that hunted fast, agile prey. If they were cold-blooded, they couldn't have chased down Triceratops or other dinosaurs effectively. But fossilized tackways showed dinosaurs running, maneuvering, and maintaining complex movement patterns, behavior more in line with warm-blooded animals. Even better, some dinosaurs had feathers, or feather-like structures, which wouldn't make much sense if they were cold-blooded. Feathers aren't just for flying, they're amazing for regulating temperature. Think about a chicken or a penguin. Feathers keep them warm even in cold environments. If dinosaurs had feathers, it suggests they needed to maintain a stable internal temperature, which points to some form of warm-bloodedness. Feathered dinosaurs like Microraptor weren't just gliding around for fun. They were maintaining enough energy to move quickly, hunt, and stay active, even when it was chilly outside. Another piece of evidence comes from bone growth rates. Scientists can study the rings in dinosaur bones, similar to counting tree rings, to see how quickly they grew. Fast growth rates often indicate high metabolism, which is a hallmark of warm-blooded animals. Many dinosaurs, including massive sauropods and smaller theropods, show growth patterns that are too rapid for typical cold-blooded reptiles. This suggests that these animals had metabolisms more like birds and mammals than lizards. Imagine a 50-foot-long dinosaur growing hundreds of pounds in a single year. That takes serious energy and internal heat regulation. Here's another fun angle: the environment dinosaurs lived in. Fossils have been found in polar regions, areas that would have been far too cold for sluggish, sun-dependent reptiles. Some dinosaurs thrived in seasonal climates with long, cold winters. If they were cold-blooded, survival in these regions would have been almost impossible. Instead, these dinosaurs likely generated their own heat internally, allowing them to stay active year-round. Picture a dinosaur wandering through snow or icy lakes, not exactly the cold-blooded lizard image from the textbooks. Now, let's address the in-between idea. Not every dinosaur was fully warm-blooded like a hummingbird. Some researchers think dinosaurs had a spectrum of metabolic rates, ranging from reptile-like in some huge sauropods to bird-like in smaller, active predators. Big dinosaurs might have had slower metabolisms simply because maintaining heat in a body the size of a house is tricky, while smaller dinosaurs likely needed higher metabolism to fuel their quick movements, hunting, and social behavior. So instead of thinking cold-blooded or warm-blooded, it's better to picture dinosaurs as metabolic chameleons, adapting to their size, environment, and lifestyle. And here's something that really makes this myth fascinating. It completely changes how we imagine dinosaur behavior. If dinosaurs were warm-blooded, they were likely active hunters, social animals, and explorers of their environments, not lazy lizards lounging in the sun all day. They could migrate, hunt at different times of day, and survive in climates we wouldn't normally associate with reptiles. It also opens up the possibility of more complex behaviors, like pack hunting, nurturing their young, or even displaying elaborate courtship rituals. Basically, they were more dynamic and fascinating than we ever imagined. Think about the mental image for a second. Instead of cold, sluggish giants sunbathing until they get hungry, imagine a flock of feathered dinosaurs darting through the underbrush, chasing prey, maintaining territory, and interacting socially. Or picture a T-Rex stalking its prey through a misty morning, fully alert and mobile, not waiting for the sun to warm its muscles. The prehistoric world becomes alive in a completely new way when you realize that dinosaurs weren't just massive, lazy reptiles. They were vibrant, active, and in some cases, incredibly efficient predators. And this myth also explains why modern birds are so fascinating. Birds are living dinosaurs, and they're all warm-blooded. They maintain high activity levels, migrate across continents, and show complex behaviors. If birds evolved from dinosaurs, it makes sense that their ancestors weren't cold-blooded either. The warm-blooded traits we see in birds today are like a living legacy of dinosaur metabolism, a window into the energy, speed, and lifestyle of creatures that lived millions of years ago. So, the next time someone tells you dinosaurs were just cold-blooded reptiles, smile and shake your head. That image belongs to the past, like outdated textbook diagrams in early black-and-white dinosaur films. The truth is far more exciting. Dinosaurs were a diverse group of creatures with metabolisms that allowed them to be active, adaptable, and incredibly successful for over 165 million years. Whether fully warm-blooded or somewhere in between, they weren't sitting around on rocks waiting for the sun. They were moving, hunting, surviving, and thriving in a way that would make any modern animal envious. In conclusion, the myth of cold-blooded dinosaurs is dead, extinct, just like the creatures themselves. Today we know many dinosaurs had metabolisms that allowed for activity, speed, and survival in varied environments. They were feathered or partially feathered, capable of running, hunting, and exploring, and sometimes even exhibiting behavior that hints at intelligence. Dinosaurs weren't sluggish reptiles. They were the dynamic, thriving, and astonishing animals that set the stage for the birds we see today. So, the next time you picture a dinosaur, forget the sunbathing lizard image. Imagine something much more alive, much more active, and a whole lot more amazing. Bowl of ice.
All dinosaurs lived together. All right, let's set the scene. When most people think of dinosaurs, they picture a world like something straight out of a theme park movie. T-Rex stomping around next to Triceratops, velociraptors darting between trees, and maybe a giant brachiosaurus reaching for some tasty treetop leaves. It's like a prehistoric petting zoo, right? Everything coexists at the same time. Sounds awesome, but here's the thing. That's completely wrong. Dinosaurs didn't all live together in one giant Jurassic playground. In fact, most of the dinosaurs we know about lived millions of years apart, and often on different continents. First, Let's talk about time. Dinosaurs existed for roughly 165 million years, from the Triassic period, about 230 million years ago, to the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago. That's a mind-boggling span of time, way longer than mammals have been around. Over those millions of years, dinosaurs evolved into a huge variety of shapes, sizes, and lifestyles. Imagine looking at a family photo album that spans 165 million years and assuming everyone in the pictures went on vacation together. That's basically what people do when they imagine all dinosaurs living at the same time. Here's an example to help you picture it. Tyrannosaurus rex, one of the most famous dinosaurs ever, lived during the late Cretaceous period, around 68 to 66 million years ago. Meanwhile, Stegosaurus, the famous plated dinosaur, lived way earlier, during the late Jurassic period, around 155 to 150 million years ago. That's almost 80 million years apart. If we put them together in a movie scene, it's like putting a modern-day human next to a woolly mammoth and calling it a realistic snapshot. Totally inaccurate, but it happens all the time in films. Now let's talk about geography. Dinosaurs didn't roam the entire planet. They were separated by oceans, mountains, and shifting continents. Plate tectonics split the Earth into land masses that moved over millions of years, meaning that a dinosaur living in what is now North America might not have ever encountered one living in Asia. For instance, velociraptors lived in what is now Mongolia, while Triceratops lived in North America. So even if they were alive at the same time, there's zero chance they ever crossed paths. So imagining a T-Rex munching alongside a velociraptor, not happening. Another fun angle is ecosystem differences. Dinosaurs evolved to fit specific niches, much like animals today. Some were herbivores, grazing in forests, others were predators, stalking plains, and some lived near rivers or lakes. Their bodies, diets, and behaviors were adapted to their local environments. So even within the same period, two species might never interact simply because their habitats were completely different. Think of it like imagining a polar bear and a lion hanging out together. Technically possible, but extremely unlikely given their environmental needs. Here's something that might surprise you. Paleontologists use fossil layers to figure out when and where dinosaurs lived. Each layer of rock represents a different slice of time, often millions of years apart. When they dig up fossils, they don't just find a jumble of every dinosaur ever. They see patterns. Certain species only appear in specific layers, showing us exactly when they roamed the Earth. This is how we know that dinosaurs like Allosaurus and Apatosaurus were Jurassic residents, while T-Rex and Triceratops dominated the Cretaceous. The fossil record is basically a time travel map that shows us dinosaurs didn't all share the same stage. And yet, media loves to mix them all together. Jurassic Park, for instance, has dinosaurs from multiple periods, continents, and ecosystems interacting like neighbors in a suburban cul-de-sac. It's fun, dramatic, and visually impressive, but scientifically it's a total mashup. It's like saying your grandparents, great-grandparents, and their ancestors all went to the same high school reunion. Fun to imagine, but impossible in reality. So why does this myth persist? Part of it's because dinosaurs are so iconic, and we like imagining the ultimate dinosaur lineup. Also, when kids first learn about dinosaurs, they're often shown a variety of species without clear timelines. Over time, the idea of all dinosaurs coexisting sticks in the imagination. And let's be honest, seeing a T-Rex next to a Stegosaurus or a Triceratops is way more exciting than imagining them separated by tens of millions of years. Here's a fun way to think about it. Picture the Earth as a giant theater.
Dinosaurs performed on that stage over 165 million years, but each species had its own act, its own time, and its own audience. Sometimes the acts overlapped slightly, but most of the time they were playing on completely different stages. T-Rex's act was one of the final performances before the curtain fell on the age of dinosaurs. Stegosaurus had its spotlight long before, and Velociraptor had its own dramatic entrance in a completely different region. They were all stars, but their shows weren't happening at the same time. Even cooler, understanding this helps us appreciate dinosaurs' evolution. Over millions of years, dinosaurs adapted to changing climates, predators, and food sources. Their evolution wasn't static. They weren't just stuck in one era waiting for the next species to appear. By realizing that dinosaurs were separated by time and geography, we get a richer, more complex picture of the prehistoric world. It wasn't just a single moment frozen in time. It was a dynamic, ever-changing planet full of species rising and falling across millennia. So the next time you watch a dinosaur movie, or imagine a prehistoric scene, remember this. Dinosaurs didn't all live together in a single Jurassic zoo. T-Rex didn't run into Stegosaurus, Velociraptor didn't gang up with Triceratops, and a Brachiosaurus probably never saw a T-Rex coming. Instead, dinosaurs were spread out across time and space, each species occupying its own unique slice of Earth's long history. It makes the story of dinosaurs even more amazing because it shows just how long and diverse their reign really was.
Stegosaurus was dumb. All right, let's talk about Stegosaurus. You know the one. The dinosaur with the giant plates running down its back and the spiky tail that looks like it was designed to give predators a serious headache? For decades, Stegosaurus has had a reputation in popular culture as, well, kind of a dim-witted dinosaur. You've probably heard it before. That dino had a brain the size of a walnut. People love to joke about how it could barely function, let alone survive in the brutal prehistoric world. But here's the kicker. That reputation is mostly misleading. Stegosaurus wasn't exactly a genius, but calling it dumb doesn't do it justice. Let's start with the infamous brain size idea. Stegosaurus did have a small brain relative to its body, about the size of a dog's, or even smaller, depending on the specimen. For a dinosaur that could reach 30 feet long and weigh several tons, a walnut-sized brain sounds absurd. But here's the thing. Brain size doesn't tell the whole story. Just because a brain is small doesn't mean the animal was incapable of complex behavior. In fact, many modern animals have surprisingly small brains, but are still excellent at survival. Birds, for example, have tiny brains compared to mammals, yet they navigate, hunt, migrate, and even solve puzzles. Size isn't everything. Organization and specialization matter more. Here's a fascinating detail. Stegosaurus had a series of nerve centers and ganglia along its spinal cord, particularly near its tail. For a long time, scientists speculated that it might have had a second brain in its hip area to help coordinate its massive body and tail. While this isn't literally a brain, it does suggest Stegosaurus had a sophisticated nervous system designed for coordination. Think about it. Maneuvering a 30-foot-long body with giant plates on your back and a tail loaded with spikes isn't easy. That requires precise motor control, reflexes, and awareness of your surroundings. That's more intelligence than people give it credit for. And let's not forget about those plates on its back. They weren't just for show. They likely served multiple purposes: thermoregulation, display, and defense. If you think about it, managing blood flow to those plates, keeping them at the right temperature, and using them for signaling other Stegosaurus individuals requires a certain level of biological sophistication. This wasn't just a clumsy giant stumbling through the forest. It was a creature adapted to survive and thrive in its environment. Stegosaurus also had to defend itself from predators. Its tail, often called a phagomizer, was loaded with long spikes capable of serious damage. Using that effectively would have required coordination and spatial awareness. Imagine swinging a tail several feet long at a charging Allosaurus. You can't just flail randomly. It had to aim, balance, and time its swings precisely. That's a form of intelligence, just not the kind measured by brain size alone. Survival in the Jurassic world required brains of many kinds, not just big ones. Here's a fun way to picture it. Imagine trying to run across a room carrying a massive backpack, balancing on slippery floors while waving a spiked club at anyone who approaches. That's basically what Stegosaurus had to do every day. Even if it wasn't plotting world domination, it was handling complex tasks that required coordination, reflexes, and awareness of its environment. If that's dumb, then I'll happily redefine the word. And there's more. Stegosaurus wasn't just surviving. It was likely interacting socially in some ways. Fossil evidence suggests that some stegosaurs may have lived in small groups or herds. That kind of social interaction, even at a basic level, requires communication, recognition, and memory. Again, none of this requires a massive brain, but it does show Stegosaurus was far more capable than the walnut brain jokes would have you believe. It's also worth noting that Stegosaurus lived in a time with serious predators, like Allosaurus. If it had been truly dumb, it wouldn't have survived long enough to reproduce and maintain its species. Evolution doesn't favor stupidity, especially not in a world as competitive as the Jurassic. Its adaptations, from defensive spikes to sensory nerves and plate management, show a creature finely tuned to survive, despite what early scientists might have assumed about its intellect. Here's a little historical context. The idea that Stegosaurus was dumb comes from early paleontology in the late 1900s. Scientists were amazed by its small brain size and assumed a direct correlation between brain mass and intelligence, an idea that's overly simplistic. As science has progressed, we now know that behavioral complexity doesn't always scale with brain size, and that Stegosaurus was likely much more competent than those early diagrams implied. Let's make it more relatable. Imagine a person with small hands, but who is an amazing pianist. Their hands might look incapable at first glance, but they can perform incredibly complex tasks. Stegosaurus is similar. It may have had a small brain in relative terms, but it was more than enough to manage its body, defend itself, interact socially, and survive millions of years. Finally, there's a bit of humor here too. People love to make jokes about Stegosaurus being dumb, and that's fine, but the truth is way cooler. Instead of thinking of it as a brainless tank, imagine it as a well-coordinated, cautious, armored giant with the tools and smarts it needed to survive in a dangerous world. Those plates and spikes weren't just for show. They were part of a carefully managed survival strategy and the nervous system to make it all work efficiently. That's cleverness of a sort that goes way beyond what we usually think of when we say brainy. In conclusion, the myth that Stegosaurus was dumb is largely based on outdated assumptions about brain size. While its brain was small relative to its body, Stegosaurus had complex sensory nerves, coordination, and survival skills that made it a capable, well-adapted dinosaur. From its defensive tail to its massive back plates and possible social behavior, it was far from the slow, stupid, lumbering creature often depicted. Next time someone jokes about Stegosaurus's walnut brain, you can smile and think, actually, it was way smarter than you realize.
Pterosaurs were not dinosaurs. All right, let's clear something up that trips a lot of people up. Pterosaurs were not dinosaurs. Shocking, right? You've probably seen pictures of giant flying reptiles soaring over Jurassic landscapes or swooping down to snatch fish from rivers and instinctively thought, yep, that's a dinosaur. But here's the thing. Technically, they aren't. There's something different, though just as fascinating. Flying reptiles that evolved their own way. First, let's talk about what makes a dinosaur a dinosaur. Dinosaurs are a specific group of reptiles that walk with legs positioned directly under their bodies, not sprawling to the sides like lizards. They also share certain skeletal features, like holes in the hip socket and particular arrangements of their limbs and vertebrae. Dinosaurs are split into two main groups: Saurischia, lizard-hipped, including T-Rex and Brachiosaurus, and Ornithischia, bird-hipped, like Triceratops and Stegosaurus. To be a dinosaur, you had to fit into this family tree. Enter Pterosaurs. They were reptiles, yes, and they lived at the same time as dinosaurs, but their bodies evolved in a completely different direction. Pterosaurs had wings made of a membrane of skin and muscle stretching from their elongated fourth finger down to their hind limbs. This is nothing like bird or bat wings, completely unique. Their bones were hollow and lightweight. Their skulls often sported massive crests, and some of the largest species, like Quetzalcoatlus, had wingspans over 30 feet. They were built for flight, not walking around, stomping on the ground like T-Rex. So why do so many people confuse pterosaurs with dinosaurs? Partly it's because they lived in the same world, ate similar foods, and sometimes appear in the same museums or movies. If you see a T-Rex chasing a pterosaur in the movie, it's easy to assume they're related. Pop culture tends to lump all these prehistoric reptiles together, calling everything from tiny bird-like predators to giant flying monsters dinosaurs. But the truth is more interesting. Pterosaurs were distant cousins, evolving in parallel to dinosaurs, but charting their own path entirely. Let's get a little cooler. Pterosaurs were masters of the sky. Some species were small, like the sparrow-sized Nemacolopterus, flitting between trees hunting insects. Others, like the massive Pteranodon or Quetzalcoatlus, dominated the skies like the eagles and condors of today, even reaching into sizes that made humans look tiny next to their wingspan. Their flight required a combination of lightweight bones, powerful muscles, and incredible coordination. In fact, their brains were highly adapted for flying. They had large regions for vision and balance, critical for navigating wind currents and catching prey in midair. That's a level of specialization that dinosaurs never needed. Here's an interesting twist. Some pterosaurs even had elaborate crests on their heads, which might have been used for display, species recognition, or even aerodynamic purposes. Imagine a giant flying reptile with a rainbow-colored crest gliding over a river.
That's not just a predator, it's a prehistoric showstopper. And again, totally different from what we think of when we picture dinosaurs. It's also worth mentioning that while dinosaurs generally stayed on the ground or climbed a bit, pterosaurs took to the skies. They exploited ecological niches that no dinosaur could reach. Need a creature to fish from rivers, soar over mountains, or travel long distances without touching the ground? Enter pterosaurs. Their evolution is like a completely separate experiment in prehistoric survival, running parallel to dinosaurs, but focused on flight. Now, let's address a misconception. Birds evolved from dinosaurs, specifically theropod dinosaurs. That makes modern birds true dinosaurs, and in some ways the only surviving dinosaurs today. Pterosaurs, despite being airborne reptiles, did not evolve into birds. They're a separate lineage that went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. That means when you see an eagle or a sparrow, you're looking at a direct dinosaur descendant, but not a pterosaur. They were like the skybound cousins who didn't make it past the mass extinction. Here's a fun way to picture it. Imagine a Jurassic world divided into two realms, land and sky. On land, dinosaurs stomp, graze, and hunt. In the sky, pterosaurs glide, swoop, and fish. They share the planet and even time periods, but are doing completely different things, with different bodies, brains, and survival strategies. It's like thinking your dog and your parrot are the same species just because they live in your house. Close neighbors, sure, but fundamentally different. And the diversity of pterosaurs is amazing. Some were tiny, nimble insect hunters. Others had wingspans bigger than small airplanes. Some had toothy beaks for grabbing fish, while others had long, toothless bills adapted for skimming water. Some even had fuzzy, hair-like structures called picofibers, which might have helped with temperature regulation, similar to fur in mammals. In short, they were versatile, specialized, and incredibly successful in their own right, just not dinosaurs. So next time someone points at a pteranodon in the museum and says, "Look at that dinosaur," you can politely correct them. Pterosaurs were flying reptiles, not true dinosaurs. But that doesn't make them any less awesome. In fact, their distinct evolution, aerial mastery, and bizarre adaptations make them some of the coolest creatures of the Mesozoic era. They weren't lumbering giants on the ground. They were the kings of the sky, soaring above a world dominated by dinosaurs. In conclusion, the myth that pterosaurs were dinosaurs is just a convenient mix-up. While they lived alongside dinosaurs, shared ecosystems, and even interacted with them, pterosaurs were a separate branch of reptiles optimized for flight with unique adaptations and behaviors. Understanding this distinction doesn't just clear up a technicality. It opens a window into the incredible diversity of life in the Mesozoic era, showing us that dinosaurs weren't just the stars of their time. The land had its rulers, and the sky had its own masters. Both were incredible in their own right, but one definitely wasn't the other.
Dinosaurs lived with humans. All right. Let's talk about one of the most persistent dinosaur myths, the idea that humans and dinosaurs coexisted. You've probably seen this in cartoons, movies, and maybe even some older educational books. Maybe you pictured cavemen swinging clubs at T-Rex or early humans riding Brachiosaurus through lush forests. It's a fun image, right? Totally epic. But here's the reality. Dinosaurs and humans were separated by more than 66 million years. That's a mind-blowing gap that makes the idea of them living side by side completely impossible. Let's start with the timeline. Dinosaurs first appeared during the Triassic period, about 230 million years ago. They dominated the Earth throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, evolving into a huge variety of species: huge sauropods, fierce theropods, armored stegosaurs, and many more. Fast forward to 66 million years ago, at the end of the Cretaceous period, when a massive asteroid impact triggered the mass extinction that wiped out all non-avian dinosaurs. That's the famous event that ended the Mesozoic era. Humans, meanwhile, didn't appear until around 300,000 years ago. If you do the math, that's a gap of over 65 million years. To put it in perspective, humans are like a blink of an eye compared to the reign of dinosaurs. It's like imagining someone from today shaking hands with a T-Rex. Not going to happen. So why does this myth even exist? Partly, it's pop culture and imagination. Movies love to dramatize dinosaurs, and cartoons have happily paired humans with giant reptiles for centuries. Stories from early explorers and illustrators sometimes misrepresented fossils, imagining dragons or monsters coexisting with humans. Over time, this got cemented into a cultural idea that humans and dinosaurs were neighbors. Throw in some misinterpretation of fossil tracks or legends about giant beasts, and it's easy to see why people believed it. Now, here's an interesting twist. The idea that humans and dinosaurs overlapped often popped up in creationist beliefs, where timelines of Earth's history are interpreted differently. Some groups suggest that humans and dinosaurs were around at the same time, sometimes using depictions of dragons as evidence. From a scientific standpoint, though, fossil records, radiometric dating, and geological evidence make it absolutely clear that dinosaurs had been gone for tens of millions of years before the first human appeared. Let's visualize it another way. Imagine a straight timeline stretching from the first dinosaurs to today. Dinosaurs dominate a huge chunk of it, millions upon millions of years. Then, after the dinosaurs disappear, the Earth undergoes massive changes. Continents shift, mammals evolve, and eventually, humans arrive. On this timeline, humans appear almost at the very last fraction of the total story. If the dinosaurs were the main stars of a movie, humans wouldn't even appear until the very, very end credits. And fossil evidence backs this up. There are no human fossils in Cretaceous rock layers. None, not one. Dinosaurs are found in layers that are millions of years older than the first human fossils. Paleontologists have found early mammals living alongside dinosaurs, but those were tiny, often mouse-sized creatures, scurrying underfoot while T-Rex or Triceratops roamed. These little mammals were the real early humans in evolutionary terms, but they didn't look anything like us. Humans evolved long after the Mesozoic era ended. Here's a fun mental image. Picture a T-Rex wandering across a forest in North America, stomping through ferns and hunting prey. Around that same time, mammals were hiding in the underbrush, no bigger than squirrels. Millions of years later, humans finally evolve. If you tried to draw a family tree connecting humans and dinosaurs, it wouldn't line up. We're more like distant cousins in the grand story of life, separated by an enormous chasm of time. Another reason this myth persists is because of misinterpreted footprints or fossils. Occasionally, people find giant tracks or unusual bones and imagine that humans must have walked alongside dinosaurs. In reality, these are either dinosaur tracks themselves, fossilized natural patterns, or, in some cases, hoaxes. Scientists carefully date fossils using radiometric dating, and every piece of evidence consistently shows that humans and non-avian dinosaurs never overlapped. Even birds, the living descendants of dinosaurs, don't really count as coexisting with classical dinosaurs in this myth. Modern birds evolved long after the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. So while you could technically say humans coexist with dinosaur descendants today, like pigeons, eagles, and ostriches, it's not the same as living with actual T-Rex or Triceratops. That's a nuance that often gets overlooked in popular imagination. And think about the ecosystem. Dinosaurs were part of an entirely different world. Massive reptiles, huge plants, and predators that could crush bones. Humans evolved in ecosystems dominated by mammals, not giant reptiles. If humans had existed during the age of dinosaurs, the dynamics of hunting, survival, and society would have been unimaginably different. The fact that we didn't coexist is part of why both humans and dinosaurs could thrive independently in their respective eras. Here's a fun way to imagine it. If you tried to make a movie where humans fight dinosaurs for survival, you'd be creating a completely fictional story. Sure, it's thrilling to watch, but it's pure imagination. The truth, though, is amazing in its own way. Dinosaurs ruled Earth for millions of years. Humans evolved long after. And in that gap of time, the Earth saw incredible changes. Oceans shifting, mountains forming, and species evolving in ways that laid the groundwork for our own existence. In conclusion, the myth that humans lived alongside dinosaurs is just that, a myth. Dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years before humans appeared, and no fossil evidence suggests otherwise. Understanding this gap not only clears up misconceptions, but also gives us a deeper appreciation for the scale of Earth's history. Dinosaurs ruled a world that humans never set foot in, and humans evolved in an ecosystem shaped by the extinction of those incredible creatures. So the next time someone imagines cavemen swinging clubs at T-Rex, you can smile knowing the reality is even more mind-blowing. Humans and dinosaurs never met, separated by millions of years of Earth's incredible story.
Brontosaurus didn't exist. All right. Let's talk about one of the most famous dinosaur myths of all time, the Brontosaurus controversy. If you grew up loving dinosaurs, you probably learned that Brontosaurus, yes, the giant, long-necked, leaf-munching dinosaur, never actually existed. Museums even labeled it as Apatosaurus, claiming Brontosaurus was a mistake from over a century ago. For decades, this idea was drilled into our brains. Brontosaurus was basically a myth, a dinosaur that lived only in our imaginations. But here's the twist. Recent studies suggest that Brontosaurus really is its own genus, and that old story about it being a mistake, well, that might need a serious rewrite. First, some history. Back in the late 1800s, paleontology was basically a giant race to name and classify every new fossil that was dug up. Scientists like O.C. Marsh and Edward Cope were in what's famously called the Bone Wars, a crazy rivalry where they rushed to name new species before the other. In 1877, Marsh described Apatosaurus, and just a few years later, in 1879, he described Brontosaurus. The problem? The fossils were similar, and the scientific consensus eventually decided that Brontosaurus wasn't different enough. It was just another Apatosaurus. Museums followed suit, and for decades, Brontosaurus became the dinosaur that never existed. So why do we still hear the name Brontosaurus? Partly nostalgia, partly culture. Movies, cartoons, and toys continued to use Brontosaurus because it sounded cooler and was easier to remember. Kids loved saying it, and the name stuck in popular imagination, even though scientific community said it was wrong. It became one of those quirks where science and pop culture were slightly out of sync. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In 2015, a team of paleontologists took a fresh look at all the Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus fossils. They didn't just eyeball the bones. They used modern computer analyses, comparing hundreds of bones and measuring subtle differences in structure, proportions, and anatomy. What they found was surprising. Some specimens labeled Apatosaurus were actually distinct enough to be classified as Brontosaurus after all. That's right, the long-lost Brontosaurus, thought extinct from scientific literature, was resurrected as a valid genus. So what makes Brontosaurus different from Apatosaurus? Mostly subtle anatomical features, differences in the neck vertebrae and the proportions of certain limb bones and the shape of the tail. It's not like one was enormous and the other was tiny. They're both massive, long-necked sauropods. But these small differences are enough for paleontologists to justify giving Brontosaurus its own name again. Think of it like two car models from the same brand. They looked similar, but the engine, design, and features are distinct enough to call them separate models. That's what scientists realized about Brontosaurus. And let's be honest, Brontosaurus just sounds cooler. Try saying Apatosaurus 5 times fast. It's a mouthful. Brontosaurus sounds like it should stomp across the plains, swinging its tail, munching on treetops, and causing awe wherever it goes. So it's no wonder pop culture clung to it, even when science said otherwise. It's kind of a win for imagination meeting reality. The dinosaur finally gets its proper name back, centuries later. This myth also highlights how science evolves. For decades, textbooks confidently declared Brontosaurus a mistake, and people memorized it as a fact. But as our methods improve, we can revisit old conclusions and sometimes find out the story was more complicated. Fossils aren't always easy to interpret, and paleontology isn't just digging up bones. It's comparing, measuring, and using the latest technology to understand life from millions of years ago. Brontosaurus is a perfect example, a creature erased by scientific convention, only to be reinstated after careful study. Here's another cool detail. Brontosaurus, like Apatosaurus, was an enormous herbivore, reaching up to 75 feet long, with a neck that could reach high into trees to grab foliage. Its tail, long and whip-like, may have been used for defense or communication. It lived in the late Jurassic period, sharing its world with predators like Allosaurus and other herbivorous giants. Imagine a herd of Brontosaurus grazing peacefully while predators lurk nearby. It's a classic image of the Jurassic landscape, and now we can say with confidence that these majestic creatures really did exist as their own genus. And the resurrection of Brontosaurus also shows something important about scientific humility. Science isn't static. It's not a list of unchanging facts. It's constantly updating, improving, and correcting itself when new evidence comes along. The Brontosaurus saga is a perfect example of this process. A name dismissed for over a century, now reinstated thanks to careful study. It's a reminder that science is exciting, precisely because it's always questioning, always revising, and sometimes giving second chances, even to dinosaurs. Finally, this myth also touches on something fun: our love of names. Humans love to label things, to classify, and to make sense of the world. For a long time, Brontosaurus was a name that sparked imagination, even if it wasn't officially scientific. Now that it's back, it bridges the gap between scientific accuracy and cultural memory. Kids can scream Brontosaurus at the top of their lungs, and paleontologists can nod and say, actually, you're right. It's a valid genus. It's a rare moment where pop culture and science agree. In conclusion, the myth that Brontosaurus didn't exist is outdated. For decades, it was considered a mistake, lumped together with Apatosaurus and removed from scientific discussion. But recent studies using modern techniques and careful analysis have restored Brontosaurus as a valid genus. It's a giant, long-necked herbivore that roamed the late Jurassic period, living alongside predators and other massive dinosaurs. Its story reminds us that science is always evolving, that names matter, and that sometimes even the most famous myths can turn out to be true. So the next time someone confidently says Brontosaurus isn't real, you can smile and tell them, actually, it really is, and it's back, bigger and badder than ever.
All dinosaurs were scaly. All right, let's talk about a myth that's been around for decades. The idea that all dinosaurs were scaly, lizard-like creatures. When most people imagine dinosaurs, they picture thick, leathery skin, armored plates, or rough scales. Basically, oversized reptiles that look like giant Komodo dragons. That image has dominated pop culture for years, from Jurassic Park to countless cartoons. But here's the truth. Many dinosaurs weren't scaly at all. In fact, a lot of them had feathers, quills, or feather-like structures, including some of the most famous species like Tyrannosaurus rex. Yep, T-Rex wasn't always the scaly, toothy monster Hollywood made it out to be, especially when it was young. First, a bit of history. The traditional view of dinosaurs as scaly reptiles comes from early paleontology. Fossils of skin impressions from certain dinosaurs showed scales, and early reconstructions reflected that. Since reptiles like lizards and crocodiles were the closest living relatives, it made sense at the time to imagine dinosaurs the same way. But as fossil discoveries improved, especially in places like China's Liaoning province, paleontologists started uncovering something incredible: perfectly preserved feathered dinosaurs. Some of these fossils weren't tiny little birds. They were larger, predatory dinosaurs, often with feathers covering their bodies, wings, or tails. Now, this doesn't mean every dinosaur was a feathery fluffball, but it does mean feathers were far more common than previously thought. Small theropods like Velociraptor and Microraptor were covered in feathers that probably helped with insulation, display, or even gliding. And the crazy part? Evidence suggests that even juvenile T-Rex may have had feathers, at least partially. Imagine a juvenile T-Rex running around looking less like a scaly monster and more like a giant, terrifying, fluffy chicken. It's hard to picture, but fossil evidence supports it. Why feathers? Well, feathers aren't just for flying. They serve multiple functions: insulation, signaling, mating displays, and even sensory purposes. For smaller dinosaurs, feathers helped maintain body heat, which is crucial for warm-blooded creatures. Even for larger dinosaurs, juveniles might have needed feathers for warmth before their massive size made insulation less of an issue. And let's not forget the display. Colorful feathers could have helped dinosaurs communicate, attract mates, or intimidate rivals. Scaly dinosaurs just don't have the same visual impact.
Even some large carnivores, like certain tyrannosaur relatives, may have sported patches of feathers on their arms, back, or tail. This totally changes the image we've had of dinosaurs for over a century. T-Rex wasn't just a hulking lizard. It might have had a mix of scales and feathers, and its juvenile forms could have looked quite fuzzy. Some reconstructions now show them as dynamic, bird-like creatures with striking colors, capable of intimidation and subtle communication. Here is an interesting mental image. Picture a pack of juvenile T-Rex running through the forest, their partially feathered bodies shimmering in the sunlight. They're hunting, playing, or perhaps learning to survive. It's a far cry from the scaly monsters we've been conditioned to imagine. Feathers weren't just for the small or flying dinosaurs. They were part of a widespread evolutionary trend across many species. Some scientists even suggest the ancestor of all dinosaurs might have had primitive feathers, meaning scaly dinosaurs might actually be the exception rather than the rule. And let's not ignore the ornamental possibilities. Some dinosaurs, like the famous Deinocheirus or certain oviraptorosaurs, may have used feathers to look more impressive to rivals or mates. Imagine bright plumage, colorful tails, or striking crests. These aren't just for show, they're evolutionary tools for survival, helping dinosaurs communicate without fighting. So feathers weren't just decoration. They were functional, practical, and widespread. Even the popular scaly dinosaurs like Triceratops or Ankylosaurs may have had some feathery filaments or proto-feathers in parts of their bodies. While armor and heavy scales were important for defense, nature doesn't always stick to one method. It's possible these dinosaurs had a mix: scales for protection in some areas, feathery covering in others, especially for young animals. The more we discover, the more complex and nuanced the picture becomes. Here's why this myth is so persistent. Movies, books, and illustrations for decades showed dinosaurs as giant lizards because it was easier to imagine and draw. Feathers once associated only with birds, so the idea that terrifying predators could be fluffy seemed ridiculous. But science doesn't care if it's dramatic or comfortable. It cares about evidence. And the evidence is clear. Dinosaurs were diverse, dynamic, and often feathery. So the next time you picture a velociraptor or T-Rex, try imagining them with feathers or feather-like structures. They could have been colorful, soft, and surprisingly bird-like, at least when they were young. Their scales were just a part of the story. Feathers played a huge role in their biology, behavior, and evolution. And this is one of the coolest things about dinosaurs. The more we learn, the less they resemble the stiff, scaly monsters we've imagined for so long, and the more they resemble the dynamic, adaptable, and fascinating creatures they actually were. In conclusion, the myth that all dinosaurs were scaly is completely outdated. Fossil evidence now shows that many dinosaurs had feathers or feather-like structures, and even iconic species like T-Rex may have been partially fluffy as juveniles. Feathers weren't just for flight, they were for warmth, display, and communication, making dinosaurs more complex and bird-like than we ever imagined. So the next time someone pictures dinosaurs as nothing but giant reptiles, you can smile and know the real story. Dinosaurs were far more diverse, colorful, and feathery than popular culture has led us to believe. Velociraptors were huge like in movies. All right, it's time to talk about one of the most iconic dinosaurs in pop culture, the Velociraptor. If you grew up watching Jurassic Park or seeing dinosaur documentaries, you probably picture velociraptors as terrifying 6 to 7 foot tall predators, hunting in packs, tearing through jungles and humans alike. Big, fast, deadly, the ultimate dinosaur villain. But here's the reality check. Real velociraptors were way smaller than that. Like about the size of a turkey. Yeah, a turkey. First, let's get the numbers straight. Real velociraptors were roughly 2 meters long from snout to tail, but most of that length was tail. Their height at the hip was only around 0.5 meters, or about 1.6 feet. They weighed roughly 15 to 33 pounds, basically what a large turkey weighs. So the terrifying, man-sized predators from the movies? Totally Hollywood exaggeration. But even though they were small, velociraptors were still amazing, highly adapted hunters. Size isn't everything, after all. Now, why do people picture them as giants? That comes from a mix of paleontology confusion and filmmaking choices. The dinosaur called Velociraptor in Jurassic Park were actually based on fossils of a related species called Deinonychus. Deinonychus was much bigger, about twice the size of a real velociraptor. So filmmakers used it as inspiration to create a more dramatic and cinematic predator. In other words, Hollywood wanted something terrifying on screen, and a turkey-sized dinosaur wouldn't have that same impact. But let's not underestimate the real velociraptor. Even though it was small, it was incredibly well adapted for hunting. Its most famous feature is the sickle-shaped claw on its second toe, which it could extend and retract like a switchblade. This claw was sharp and strong, capable of slicing into prey much larger than itself. Imagine a turkey with a wickedly sharp dagger on each foot. That's Velociraptor, the ultimate small predator. Velociraptors were also fast and agile, able to maneuver through forests or open terrain quickly. Their long tails acted like a counterbalance, giving them incredible stability while running or turning. They were lightweight, streamlined, and built for speed. So even if they weren't giants, they were still fearsome predators in their own right. Size doesn't define effectiveness. Skill, speed, and intelligence do. Speaking of intelligence, velociraptors were likely among the smartest dinosaurs too. Their brains were large relative to their body size, which suggests advanced sensory abilities and hunting strategies. Some scientists believe they may have hunted in packs, though this is still debated. Even if they didn't, their coordination, vision, and agility made them efficient hunters. A turkey-sized predator with intelligence and speed, that's still terrifying if you're a small lizard or mammal in the late Cretaceous. Another interesting point, velociraptors weren't just ground-based predators. Evidence shows that they had feathers, which could have helped with temperature regulation, balance, or display. So imagine a turkey-sized velociraptor covered in quills or feathers, stalking prey with that deadly claw ready. It's small, yes, but still impressive, dynamic, and fully equipped for survival. Let's also clear up some misconceptions about their jaws. Movie velociraptors are often shown with huge, snapping jaws, taking bites out of humans effortlessly. In reality, their jaws were proportionate to their size, built to grip and tear, but not massive enough to tackle something human-sized in one bite. Their hunting strategy likely involved speed, precision, and the use of their claws, rather than brute force alone. They were predators of small to medium-sized animals, not giant T-Rex-level slayers. Here's a fun mental image. Picture a turkey running across the forest floor, feathers ruffled, claws extended, eyes focused, tail swaying for balance, and suddenly, bam! It leaps, uses its claw to grab a lizard or small mammal, and scurries off. That's basically the real velociraptor in action. Small? Yes. Cute? Not quite. Effective? Absolutely. And remember, real velociraptors lived in Mongolia and Central Asia, not the lush jungles of Jurassic Park.
Their environment was likely a mix of deserts, river valleys, and forests. Despite their small size, they thrived in a competitive ecosystem, sharing space with other dinosaurs, reptiles, and mammals. Survival wasn't about being the biggest. It was about being fast, smart, and adaptable. So why does this myth persist? Partly because movies and media love bigger, scarier visuals. Velociraptors were portrayed as giant killing machines because, well, that sells tickets. Pop culture often overrides scientific accuracy, and the image of a man-sized velociraptor became iconic. But now, thanks to fossils, detailed skeletal analysis, and feather evidence, we know the real story. Velociraptors were small, feathered, turkey-sized predators, but no less fascinating. In conclusion, the myth that velociraptors were huge like in the movies is just that, a myth. Real velociraptors were about the size of a turkey, feathered, fast, and highly intelligent predators. They didn't tower over humans, but they were perfectly adapted to their environment and their prey. Hollywood may have exaggerated for drama, but the truth is no less exciting. Small, smart, agile, and deadly in their own way. Next time someone points at a velociraptor in a museum or movie and says, "That thing was massive," you can smile and correct them. Actually, it was about turkey-sized and way cooler than the movie version.
Dinosaurs couldn't swim. All right, let's dive into a myth that might seem obvious at first. The idea that dinosaurs couldn't swim. I know what you're thinking. Dinosaurs were huge, land-dwelling reptiles, some as massive as buildings, so of course they didn't swim, right? Well, not exactly. Evidence from fossils, trackways, and anatomy suggests that some dinosaurs could indeed swim, and some might have been pretty good at it. This is one of those myths that makes sense on the surface, but crumbles under closer examination. First, let's get a little scientific. Swimming isn't just about having fins or flippers, it's about moving through water efficiently. Dinosaurs had a wide variety of body shapes and sizes, from long-necked sauropods to lean theropods to armored stegosaurs. Some of these body types were more suited to swimming than others. For example, long-necked dinosaurs like Brachiosaurus or sauropods had powerful limbs and buoyant bodies that could allow them to wade into rivers or lakes and paddle through water when necessary. They might not have been Olympic-level swimmers, but they certainly could keep themselves afloat. Now, here's where things get really interesting. There are trackways showing dinosaurs entering and moving through water. Paleontologists have discovered tracks where the footprints suddenly become shallower, smeared or elongated, as if the dinosaur was walking on the bottom of a river or swimming with its feet barely touching. In some cases, the forelimbs are missing or faint, suggesting the animal might have been buoyant and pushing itself along with its legs or partially floating. These aren't just guesses. Trackways are direct evidence of behavior, frozen in time. So clearly, at least some dinosaurs weren't strictly land-bound. Let's not forget anatomy. Many theropods and ornithopods had strong, muscular limbs and lightweight bodies, which would have helped them navigate through water. Some species likely entered rivers or lakes to cool off, escape predators, or even hunt aquatic prey. Fossil evidence suggests that hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, may have eaten aquatic plants or spent time in wetlands, which implies they could swim when necessary. So they weren't just awkwardly splashing, they could actually move effectively in water. And here's a fun twist. The largest dinosaurs might have floated surprisingly well. Massive sauropods, for instance, had air-filled bones and a lot of body volume, which makes them naturally buoyant. They may have used rivers and shallow lakes to support their weight while moving from place to place. There's even a hypothesis that some sauropods crossed rivers during migrations, using water as a way to reduce the strain on their legs. Imagine a giant brachiosaurus wading through a river, neck and head above water, casually moving across a prehistoric landscape. It's not just plausible, it's supported by fossil evidence and biomechanics. Some smaller dinosaurs also took to water for defensive purposes. If you were a small, agile dinosaur, like a Compsognathus or a juvenile velociraptor, hopping into water could have helped you escape a predator. The water could slow down larger attackers, give you a chance to hide, or allow you to reach a safe shore. Essentially, swimming could have been part of a survival strategy for many species. There's also modern analogs that make this idea less surprising. Crocodiles, which share a distant ancestry with dinosaurs, are excellent swimmers. Birds, which evolved from theropod dinosaurs, are also capable of swimming in many species, from ducks to penguins. If both the ancestors and descendants of dinosaurs have swimming ability, it's reasonable to assume that at least some dinosaurs retained it. Evolution tends to keep useful abilities, especially for survival. Another interesting point is that some paleontologists suggest predatory dinosaurs may have hunted in water, similar to modern wading birds or crocodiles. Fossil evidence shows some fish bones in the stomach area of theropods, and certain anatomical features, like strong forelimbs and gripping claws, could have helped them snatch aquatic prey. So swimming wasn't just a way to move from point A to B. It could also have been a functional part of their lifestyle and hunting strategies. Now, why does this myth persist? Partly, it's our imagination. Movies, cartoons, and books often portray dinosaurs as land-only creatures because that's dramatic and simple. It's easier to visualize a T-Rex stomping through a forest than wading through a river. Also, early paleontologists didn't always have trackway evidence or preserved behavior clues, so it was assumed dinosaurs were strictly terrestrial. But as more fossils and evidence come to light, we're seeing a much richer, more nuanced picture of their behavior. Here's a fun mental image. Imagine a herd of hadrosaurs migrating across a prehistoric landscape. They come to a river, and instead of being stuck or avoiding it, they wade in. The water supports their massive weight, they paddle their legs, their long necks keep them balanced and breathing, and predators watch helplessly from the shore. This isn't a scene from a fantasy. It's a scenario supported by fossils, anatomy, and modern analysis. Dinosaurs weren't just huge land beasts. They were adaptable, resourceful, and capable of exploring new environments. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaurs couldn't swim is outdated. Fossil trackways, anatomical evidence, and modern analogs show that some dinosaurs were capable swimmers, from massive sauropods crossing rivers to smaller theropods escaping predators or hunting aquatic prey. Swimming wasn't just possible, it was likely an important part of life for many species. So the next time someone claims dinosaurs were purely land-bound creatures, you can smile and imagine them splashing, wading, and swimming across prehistoric rivers with skill and strategy.
T-Rex had tiny arms because they were useless. All right, let's talk about probably one of the most iconic images of a dinosaur. Tyrannosaurus Rex, with its massive, terrifying head, jaws that could crush bones, and those tiny little arms. For years, pop culture has treated T-Rex's arms as a joke. Why are they so small? They must be useless. Movies, cartoons, and memes have cemented the idea that T-Rex could do everything with its jaws and legs, but had completely worthless arms. But here's the thing. Those little arms weren't useless at all. In fact, they were probably highly specialized tools that helped T-Rex survive in ways we're only beginning to understand. First, let's get a sense of scale. T-Rex's arms were about 3 feet long, with 2 clawed fingers, tiny compared to its 40-foot body, massive head, and crushing jaws, but not microscopic. Each arm was muscular, with thick bones and strong tendons. These weren't the weak, floppy limbs that cartoons make them out to be. They were well-built and capable of performing specific, important functions. So why are they so small? That's still debated, but one leading idea is evolutionary trade-off. T-Rex relied overwhelmingly on its huge head and jaws for hunting and killing prey. With such a powerful bite, it didn't need long arms for combat. Over time, natural selection favored shorter, stronger arms that wouldn't get in the way when lunging at prey or tearing flesh. Essentially, T-Rex's arms evolved to be specialized rather than general purpose, like high-precision tools instead of Swiss Army knives. Now, what could those high-precision tools have been used for? Scientists have suggested several possibilities. One is mating and reproduction. T-Rex likely needed to hold on to a mate during copulation, and those strong arms could have been perfect for gripping without injuring either partner. Tiny but strong arms allowed stability while mating, something massive legs or jaws couldn't safely accomplish. Another idea is helping T-Rex stand up. After sitting or lying down, getting a 9-ton predator upright isn't easy. Muscular arms could have been used to push off the ground, stabilize the body, and leverage its enormous weight to rise quickly. Think of them as functional support arms for one of the most massive land predators to ever exist. They weren't for wrestling with prey, just practical tools for everyday life. Speaking of prey, T-Rex may have also used its arms to grasp struggling victims. Sure, the jaws did the heavy lifting, but grabbing and holding a struggling prey animal with 2 strong clawed arms could prevent it from escaping, while the massive jaws delivered the finishing bite. Some paleontologists even suggest that the arms helped hold smaller prey or stabilize larger prey while delivering targeted bites. Those claws weren't ornamental, they were tools. Here's another interesting twist. Recent biomechanical studies suggest that T-Rex's arms were surprisingly strong relative to their size. Even though they look tiny, the bones and muscle attachments indicate they could lift hundreds of pounds. For comparison, imagine having a forearm capable of lifting several hundred pounds but only 3 feet long. It's a specialized, powerful limb designed for strength over reach. That's far from useless. And don't forget their precision advantage. Long arms can be cumbersome for a predator with a massive head and neck. Shorter arms allowed T-Rex to perform close-range tasks with precision and power without interfering with hunting, biting, or balance. In other words, evolution didn't make them useless, it made them perfect for the job they were actually needed for. Now, why does this myth persist? Mostly because of pop culture. Movies exaggerate T-Rex's head size for dramatic effect, and tiny arms become an easy punchline. Kids draw cartoons with T-Rex flailing uselessly, and memes reinforce the idea that the arms were jokes.
But science tells a different story. T-Rex's arms were highly functional, just specialized in ways that humans don't immediately appreciate. Let's visualize it. Imagine a T-Rex stalking through a forest, its massive head scanning for prey. It lunges at a triceratops, jaws snapping. As the prey struggles, T-Rex reaches out with those small, strong arms, gripping tightly to stabilize the animal. The arms might help push it down or hold it steady while the jaws do the killing work. After the hunt, the predator lies down to rest, then pushes itself upright using those same arms. Tiny? Yes. Useless? Absolutely not. They were perfectly adapted to the T-Rex lifestyle. And think about this. Evolution doesn't always make limbs or features the way we expect. Arms don't need to be enormous to be effective, especially if the head or legs do the heavy lifting. T-Rex is an example of nature designing a predator that doesn't waste energy on unnecessary size. It puts its resources where they matter most: jaws, legs, and yes, specialized arms. In conclusion, the myth that T-Rex had tiny arms because they were useless is completely wrong. Fossil evidence and biomechanical studies show that those arms were strong, muscular, and highly functional, likely used for mating, standing up, and grasping prey. They were a perfect example of evolutionary specialization, not failure. So next time someone laughs at T-Rex's tiny arms, you can smile and think about how those little limbs were actually powerful tools in one of history's most famous predators' arsenal. Tiny doesn't mean useless. It means precision, strength, and adaptation.
All dinosaurs laid eggs like modern birds.
All right, let's dive into a myth that might sound simple, but actually opens up a lot of fascinating questions. The idea that all dinosaurs laid eggs like modern birds? When most people think of dinosaurs, they picture giant nests with eggs, maybe baby dinosaurs hatching and looking up at a huge parent. That image comes from countless documentaries, museum exhibits, and movies. But here's the thing. While eggs were definitely a common reproductive strategy, it's not necessarily true that every single dinosaur reproduced exactly like birds. Some species might have had unique or even partially live birth methods, especially the smaller ones. First, let's get the basics out of the way. Fossilized dinosaur eggs are well documented. Paleontologists have found nests and egg clutches from many species, including sauropods, hadrosaurs, and theropods. These fossils give us incredible insights into dinosaur reproduction. We know they laid eggs, often cared for them to some extent, and sometimes even nested in colonies. This is why the idea that all dinosaurs laid eggs seems so intuitive. It's backed by a lot of evidence. But let's zoom in on the word all. Science rarely deals in absolutes, and reproductive strategies are diverse even among modern animals. Today, most reptiles lay eggs, and most birds lay eggs. But some reptiles, like certain snakes and lizards, give live birth, either fully or partially, called ovoviviparity. So if modern animals can be flexible, it's reasonable to ask whether some dinosaurs might have evolved alternative methods. Could there have been dinosaurs that didn't lay traditional eggs, or that gave birth to partially developed young? Recent studies suggest that some small theropod dinosaurs could have had reproductive adaptations that differ from the classic egg-laying model. Fossilized embryos sometimes show unusually well-developed young inside eggs, hinting that certain species may have retained embryos longer, or even used reproductive methods closer to live birth. These weren't like mammals giving birth to live young entirely, but more like modern snakes or lizards that carry eggs internally until the babies are almost ready to hatch. In other words, while the egg was still central, the process might have been more complex than we imagined. Why does this myth persist? Partly because eggs are so iconic. When you picture a dinosaur, you naturally imagine it sitting on a nest. Eggs are easy to fossilize, so they dominate the evidence we have. Live births, or partial live births, on the other hand, leave very few traces in the fossil record. Soft tissues, internal reproductive structures, and embryonic development inside the mother rarely fossilize. That means that if some dinosaurs had alternative reproductive strategies, we might never find direct proof. But the possibility is there, and scientists remain open-minded. Even the eggs we've found show diversity. Some eggs were soft-shelled, like those of certain lizards, while others were hard-shelled, more like birds. Some nests show evidence of parental care, while others suggest eggs were left to incubate on their own. This variety tells us that reproduction among dinosaurs wasn't uniform. It evolved to suit the lifestyle, environment, and size of the species. A massive sauropod couldn't have reproduced the same way a tiny microraptor did, and the fossil record hints at these differences. Here's a fun thought experiment. Imagine a small, feathered dinosaur living in a dense forest. If laying traditional eggs exposed its young to too much predation, It might evolve a method where the eggs stayed inside longer, giving the offspring a better chance to survive. Or imagine a cold climate where external incubation was risky. Partial live birth could help embryos stay warm. Evolution tends to innovate when survival is on the line, and reproduction is one of the most crucial areas for adaptation. Even among birds, which are direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs, we see variety. Some birds lay fewer eggs, some lay eggs in hidden nests, and some even have unusual incubation methods. If modern birds can be so diverse, it's not far-fetched to think that ancient dinosaurs also had flexible reproductive strategies beyond the classic egg-laying image we're used to. So why do we keep thinking all dinosaurs were just giant egg layers like birds? Partly education, partly convenience. Eggs are easy to study, easy to display, and easy to imagine. Live birth is messier, harder to depict, and nearly invisible in the fossil record. Plus, movies, books, and documentaries love the visual of eggs and nests. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, and it reinforces a simple story. But science is rarely simple, and reality might have been far more complex and interesting. Here's another fascinating twist. Some fossils show embryos inside eggs with well-developed features like claws, teeth, or even feather impressions. This level of development could hint that those young were almost ready to function on their own, reducing the need for long parental care. In small, agile species, this might have been critical for survival. So even if they were technically egg layers, the process wasn't always like the bird model we imagine. In conclusion, the myth that all dinosaurs laid eggs exactly like modern birds is an oversimplification. Eggs were common, and many species did reproduce in ways very similar to birds. But the fossil record suggests there could have been alternative reproductive strategies, especially among small theropods. Some may have carried embryos internally longer, approaching a form of live birth, or had other adaptations to improve survival. So next time someone pictures dinosaurs only laying eggs in nests, you can remind them that the truth is far more fascinating. Dinosaur reproduction was diverse, adaptable, and occasionally surprising.
Dinosaurs dragged their tails all the time. All right, let's talk about one of the most persistent dinosaur myths. The idea that dinosaurs dragged their tails across the ground like giant lizards. If you grew up with old dinosaur books, cartoons, or even museum dioramas from decades ago, you've probably seen them portrayed this way. Long tails scraping the dirt, leaving grooves as the dinosaur walked. It looks dramatic. It looks prehistoric. But here's the truth. Most dinosaurs held their tails off the ground, often using them as a crucial part of their balance system. First, let's imagine what dragging a tail would mean. A T-Rex, for example, had a tail up to 15 feet long. If it dragged that on the ground while running or hunting, it would slow the dinosaur down, create friction, and likely wear down bones and muscles over time. Not exactly practical for a predator that relied on speed and agility. Fossil trackways support this too.
Most prints don't show tail marks, even for long-tailed dinosaurs like theropods or ornithopods. If they were dragging their tails, we would see countless tail impressions next to footprints. The absence of these marks suggests tails were lifted and actively used. So why did early artists and paleontologists depict dragging tails? Partly tradition, partly analogy. Early reconstructions relied heavily on modern reptiles like crocodiles and lizards, which do drag their tails. Since dinosaurs were originally thought to be slow, sprawling reptiles, it made sense to imagine them similarly. Plus, fossil skeletons were often found with tails lying flat on the rock, which was misleading. Early scientists thought, aha, the tail lies down, so that's how the dinosaur carried it. It seemed logical at the time, but it was wrong. Modern studies, including biomechanical modeling, show that dinosaurs were far more dynamic. Long tails acted like counterbalances for the head and body, especially in bipedal species like T-Rex or Velociraptor. Think of it like a seesaw, the heavy head and torso on one side, the long tail on the other. This balance allowed for quick turns, stability while running, and efficient movement. Dragging the tail would completely ruin that system. It's one of those elegant evolutionary tricks that made dinosaurs such incredible animals. Even large quadrupedal dinosaurs, like sauropods, likely held their tails off the ground. Some species had tails so long that dragging them would be like walking around with a 50-foot stick constantly scraping behind you. Fossils show ossified tendons along their tails, suggesting stiffness and strength that supported holding the tail elevated rather than letting it flop on the ground. These tails were functional, not decorative. They helped with balance, counterweight, and perhaps even communication or defense in some species. And here's a fun point. Some tails may have acted like whips or weapons. In species like Diplodocus, the long, thin tail might have been snapped like a bullwhip to fend off predators or rivals. Imagine dragging that tail along the ground. It wouldn't work. You need precision, lift, and mobility. Even stegosaurs, with their spiked tails, would have held them aloft to swing effectively, not dragging them uselessly behind them. Juvenile dinosaurs also likely held their tails up. Tail height helped with agility and speed, which was crucial for avoiding predators or hunting prey. Fossil evidence shows that many bipedal dinosaurs had strong tail muscles and attachment points for large tendons, all pointing to an active, elevated tail. In other words, dragging tails just didn't make sense biomechanically. So why do some people still imagine dragging tails? Movies and cartoons helped cement the idea. Early stop-motion films and illustrations loved the dramatic look of a dinosaur sweeping its tail across the dirt. It emphasized size and menace. And old museums sometimes displayed skeletons with tails curved along the ground for support, because mounting a tail off the ground was tricky with the available technology. Over time, these images became ingrained in pop culture. Modern paleontology has completely changed this picture. Advanced skeletal reconstructions, computer simulations, and fossil trackways all indicate that tails were active, mobile, and crucial for movement. Bipedal dinosaurs in particular used their tails like a built-in balancing rod, allowing them to pivot, lunge, and sprint efficiently. Quadrupeds use theirs for balance, communication, and defense. Dragging tails? That's largely a myth.
Here's a mental image to illustrate. Picture a T-Rex chasing prey. Its massive legs pump forward, its head is angled for focus, and its long tail swings slightly behind, keeping the predator perfectly balanced. Every step is coordinated, efficient, and dynamic. Now imagine dragging that tail. It would trip itself over, slow down, and ruin the chase. Clearly, evolution favored lifting the tail. Even smaller dinosaurs, like velociraptors or smaller ornithopods, held their tails high. It wasn't just for style, it was a critical survival adaptation. Agile hunters needed quick directional changes, and a lifted tail made that possible. Dragging a tail would compromise speed, balance, and agility. Fossils, biomechanics, and modern reconstructions all agree that tails were actively used and rarely dragged. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaurs dragged their tails is outdated and based on early assumptions. Fossil trackways, anatomical evidence, and biomechanical modeling show that tails were often held off the ground, acting as counterbalances, weapons, and communication tools in both bipedal and quadrupedal dinosaurs. So the next time someone pictures a dinosaur with its tail scraping the ground behind it, you can smile and imagine a long, powerful tail lifted gracefully, swinging, balancing, and making these prehistoric animals the dynamic and fascinating creatures they truly were.
Pachycephalosaurus has wooded headbutt like rams. All right, let's talk about one of the quirkiest dinosaur myths out there. The idea that Pachycephalosaurus used its thick, domed skull to headbutt rivals like modern-day rams. If you've seen dinosaur movies or cartoons, you've probably imagined two Pachycephalosaurus charging at each other, skulls slamming with a loud thunk, battling for dominance or mates. It's dramatic, fun, and makes for a great action scene, but science suggests it probably wasn't the case. Their skulls were likely used for display rather than full-on headbutting. First, let's picture the animal. Pachycephalosaurus was a bipedal dinosaur with a dome-shaped skull about 10 inches thick at the top. That dome looks ridiculously perfect for ramming, right? Combine that with spiked ridges along the back of the head, and it seems like a natural battering weapon. Early paleontologists in the 20th century thought, look at that dome, it's a battering ram, and the headbutting theory was born. For decades, textbooks, museums, and films repeated this idea. But here's the problem. Biomechanical studies of Pachycephalosaurus skulls show serious limitations. The dome is thick, sure, but the neck and vertebrae underneath weren't built to handle repeated high-impact collisions. Ramming another animal at high speed could easily fracture the skull or damage the spine. Scientists analyzed stress patterns in fossil skulls, and the results suggest that while the skull could absorb some pressure, it likely wasn't meant for full-force headbutting like rams or goats today. The bones just wouldn't survive repeated collisions. So, if Pachycephalosaurus didn't slam heads like rams, why did it have such a thick skull? The leading theory now is display and visual signaling. That dome was probably a way to look impressive, to communicate dominance, attract mates, or intimidate rivals without actual combat. Think of it like a modern deer's antlers or a lion's mane. They aren't just decoration, they send a signal. I'm strong, healthy, and worth noticing without risking injury. Evolution favors showmanship that avoids unnecessary harm. There's also the possibility of low-impact sparring. Some scientists suggest Pachycephalosaurus might have engaged in pushing contests or side-to-side shoves rather than full-on collisions.
These movements could allow them to assert dominance or compete for mates with minimal risk of injury. It's like a gentle wrestling match or a staged display, not a head-to-head death clash. Fossil evidence backs this up. Some Pachycephalosaurus skulls show small lesions or healed injuries, which could come from collisions, but they're inconsistent with repeated high-speed headbutting. Instead, these marks suggest occasional bumps or nudges or accidental contact, maybe during displays or minor contests. Real ramming would have left massive fractures, which are rare in the fossil record. And let's not forget the neck anatomy. Pachycephalosaurus had a relatively slender neck for its head size. High-impact collisions would have risked breaking it, which would be catastrophic. Display behaviors, side bumps, or posturing, on the other hand, would put much less strain on the neck while still conveying strength and dominance. Evolution tends to favor strategies that minimize risk while still getting results, and full-on ramming seems too dangerous for a dinosaur with such a delicate neck. Here's a fun way to imagine it. Picture two Pachycephalosaurus facing off. They puff themselves up, raise their thick domes, maybe twist slightly or bump gently, all while trying to look intimidating. No dramatic crashes, no bone-crushing impact, just a visual and physical display that communicates strength. It's social signaling at its finest, and much safer than crashing skulls at high speed. Interestingly, this kind of display behavior isn't unique to Pachycephalosaurus. Many modern animals use visual signals instead of risky combat. Birds display feathers, deer show antlers, and some lizards perform push-ups or head-bobbing rituals. Pachycephalosaurus fits this pattern perfectly. Evolution favors flashy, low-risk communication over life-threatening fights. So why does the myth persist? Movies, cartoons, and even older dinosaur books love drama. Two dinosaurs smashing their heads together is visually exciting, easy to understand, and fits the violent prehistoric world narrative. Display behaviors, subtle nudges, or low-risk combat, not as visually thrilling. As a result, the headbutting image stuck, even though modern science shows a more nuanced story. In conclusion, the myth that Pachycephalosaurus headbutted like rams is mostly outdated. Fossil evidence, biomechanical analysis, and modern analogs suggest that their thick skulls were likely for display, signaling, and low-risk social interactions rather than repeated high-speed collisions. They may have occasionally bumped or nuzzled each other, but smashing skulls like in the movies? Probably not. So next time someone imagines a Pachycephalosaurus duel, picture a more subtle scene. Dinosaurs showing off, nudging and posturing, proving dominance without risking a neck or skull fracture. Display beats danger every time.
Triceratops used its horns only for defense. All right, let's talk about Triceratops, one of the most famous dinosaurs ever. With its massive frill and 3 giant horns, it's often portrayed as a defensive powerhouse, ready to butt heads with T-Rex or protect its herd. Movies, cartoons, and even museum exhibits love the image of Triceratops as a walking tank, horns forward, frill raised, ready to defend itself at all costs. But here's the thing. The myth that Triceratops used its horns only for defense is way too simple. Recent studies suggest that these iconic horns were likely used for mating displays, dominance, and social signaling as much as, or even more than, actual combat. First, let's look at the horns and frill themselves. Triceratops had 2 long brow horns above its eyes and a shorter nose horn, plus a large bony frill at the back of its skull. On first glance, these features scream defense, and they probably did help protect against predators to some extent. But the frill wasn't solid muscle armor.
It was mostly bone, sometimes hollow in places, and likely wasn't strong enough to stop a bite from a large predator like T-Rex. That suggests the horns and frill had other important functions beyond pure defense. One major idea is mating and dominance displays. Think about modern animals. Deer, antelope, and goats all have impressive horns or antlers used to show off strength, intimidate rivals, and attract mates. Triceratops may have done something very similar. The size, shape, and curvature of the horns could signal age, health, or status within a herd. Big, symmetrical horns, that's a strong, healthy individual. Smaller or asymmetrical horns may be younger, weaker, or less dominant. In other words, horns were social tools, not just weapons. There's also evidence of dombat, but not the kind you'd expect. Some Triceratops fossils show puncture wounds on the frill and skull, consistent with clashes between other Triceratops. But these injuries aren't always lethal. They suggest ritualized sparring or pushing contests rather than full-on life-or-death battles. This is similar to how modern animals, like deer locking antlers or goats clashing heads, use combat to establish dominance without serious risk. In other words, horns served a dual purpose: subtle social signaling and occasional sparring. Another interesting point: the frill itself may have been a display structure. Some species show grooves, holes, or variation in frill shapes that wouldn't make sense if the frill were purely defensive. Instead, these features could be visual signals for species recognition, mate attraction, or intimidation of rivals. Imagine a herd of Triceratops with slightly different frill shapes, each individual communicating their strength and status visually. That's social complexity right there. Let's not forget that Triceratops likely lived in herds, especially younger individuals or females with offspring. Some research even suggests that the males might have had different growing rates or lifespans than females, which could affect how their horns were used.
In that context, horns and frills could help maintain social order, reduce conflicts, and even coordinate group movement. Display structures like these aren't just for combat. They're tools for communication, reducing risk, and survival in a group setting. Why does the myth persist that Triceratops used its horns only for defense? Partly because it's dramatic and simple. Giant horns against a giant predator make for an easy story. T-Rex attacks, Triceratops defends. Movies and textbooks love that image. But evolution is rarely about simplicity. It's about versatility. Structures often serve multiple functions simultaneously. And Triceratops's horns and frills are a perfect example. Defense, display, dominance, all wrapped into one set of evolutionary tools. Here's a fun mental image. Imagine a Triceratops herd grazing peacefully. A younger male approaches an older rival. They don't charge like T-Rex versus Triceratops. They stand, raise their frills, and lock eyes. Horns angled just enough to show strength. They push, test, and posture, establishing dominance without serious injury.
Nearby females observe, noting which males are the strongest or most fit. That's evolution in action. Social competition, using horns as both signal and tool. Even the size of the horns supports this idea. Some Triceratops individuals had incredibly long brow horns. Too long to be efficient for standard defense, but perfect for visual intimidation or displays. If you were a predator, those horns might look threatening from a distance, even if you could technically overpower the dinosaur in a head-to-head attack. So the horns serve multiple purposes at once: deterrence, signaling, and occasional combat. There's also a parallel with modern animals that rely heavily on visual cues. Think of peacocks, deer, or even some lizards. They use display structures to avoid dangerous fights. Triceratops may have used its horns and frills in the same way, reducing the need for constant physical conflict and minimizing the risk of injury, while still maintaining social hierarchy. In conclusion, the myth that Triceratops used its horns only for defense is overly simplistic. Fossil evidence, anatomy, and comparison with modern animals suggest that horns and frills were multifunctional. They helped deter predators, yes, but they were also crucial for mating displays, dominance contests, and social communication. These structures weren't just weapons. They were evolutionary Swiss Army knives, perfectly adapted for survival in a complex social and ecological environment. So the next time someone imagines Triceratops only fighting T-Rex, picture the subtle social drama: horns raised, frills displayed, rivals sizing each other up, and dominance determined by display as much as by brute force. Dinosaurs were solitary. All right, let's dive into a myth that might surprise a lot of people. The idea that dinosaurs were solitary creatures, wandering alone through prehistoric landscapes. If you grew up watching old dinosaur movies or reading early paleontology books, you probably imagined dinosaurs as lone predators or solitary herbivores, constantly on the move and fending for themselves. Think about a T-Rex stalking its prey alone, or a lone Triceratops wandering the forest. Dramatic, right? But here's the thing. That picture is mostly wrong. Fossil evidence increasingly shows that many dinosaurs were social, living in herds, flocks, or other organized groups. First, let's talk about the types of dinosaurs that likely lived socially. Many herbivorous species, especially the large ones like hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, and sauropods, show evidence of herd behavior. Fossils of multiple individuals preserved together suggest that these dinosaurs traveled in groups, possibly for protection against predators or to follow seasonal food sources. Imagine hundreds of duck-billed dinosaurs moving together across a floodplain. It's not just for show. Herd living provided safety in numbers. Predators like T-Rex might have a much harder time picking off individuals when confronted with a tightly organized group. Even some theropods, which we often think of as solitary hunters, show signs of social behavior.
Trackways with multiple individuals moving in parallel paths suggest coordinated movement. Fossil evidence hints that juvenile theropods may have traveled together, possibly as packs, to increase hunting success or survival. This doesn't necessarily mean they hunted like wolves exactly, but it does indicate that at least some species were more social than traditionally imagined. Why did the solitary myth persist for so long? Early paleontologists often assumed dinosaurs behaved like modern reptiles, lizards, crocodiles, and turtles, which are mostly relatively solitary. Plus, solitary fossil finds were easier to interpret. One skeleton, one animal, one story. Social behavior doesn't fossilize as obviously as bones do. Herds, interactions, and social structures are harder to detect unless you're lucky enough to find multiple skeletons preserved together or trackways indicating group movement. Now, fossilized nesting sites also support the idea of social living. Some species, like hadrosaurs, are found in massive nesting grounds with hundreds of eggs in close proximity. That's not something a strictly solitary species would do. The arrangement of these nests suggests communal behavior. Parents or groups of adults may have cared for young collectively or at least tolerated each other nearby. In other words, dinosaurs weren't just wandering alone, they were interacting, communicating, and possibly cooperating to protect their offspring. Even sauropods, the gigantic long-necked dinosaurs, likely exhibited social behavior. Fossil sites containing multiple individuals, including juveniles, suggest herding for protection or migration. Moving in groups could help them navigate long distances to find food or water, and younger, smaller individuals could benefit from the protection of older, larger adults. Herd behavior may have been crucial for survival, especially in environments with large predators lurking around. Here's an interesting twist. Communication may have played a role in their social structures.
Some dinosaurs had crests, frills, or other display structures that could help coordinate group movement, signal danger, or attract mates. Vocalizations or visual signals might have allowed them to maintain social cohesion while traveling, foraging, or nesting. So herd behavior wasn't just about proximity. It involved communication, coordination, and complex social interactions. Now, let's visualize it. Picture a herd of triceratops or hadrosaurs moving across a floodplain. Juveniles in the center for protection. Adults on the perimeter, constantly scanning for predators. A T-Rex prowls nearby, but the coordinated herd makes it harder for the predator to strike. Meanwhile, some individuals might be communicating through vocalizations, frill displays, or body posture, maintaining social bonds and group cohesion. That's a far cry from the solitary wanderer we often imagine in older depictions. Even smaller dinosaurs probably benefited from social behavior. Flocking, communal nesting, and coordinated movement could increase survival rates and efficiency in finding food. Living together also allows species to learn from one another, share knowledge of safe areas, and protect young more effectively.
Evolution favors behaviors that improve survival, and social living is a proven strategy across many modern animals, birds, mammals, and even some reptiles. Dinosaurs likely followed the same principle. So why do we still picture dinosaurs as solitary? Pop culture loves the lone predator narrative. It's easy to understand, dramatic, and fits the prehistoric struggle for survival trope. Movies like Jurassic Park often highlight the solitary menace of a T-Rex to make it scary and unpredictable. But science tells us the story was far more nuanced. Many dinosaurs, big and small, were social animals, relying on herds, flocks, and communal behaviors for survival. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaurs were solitary is outdated. Fossil evidence, trackways, nesting grounds, and anatomical studies suggest that many dinosaurs were highly social, living in groups, communicating, and coordinating for survival. Herbivores used herding for protection and migration. Juveniles traveled together, and even some carnivores may have exhibited social behaviors. Dinosaurs weren't just lone wanderers. They were complex, interactive creatures navigating a dynamic prehistoric world together. So next time someone imagines a lone dinosaur trudging through a barren landscape, picture instead a thriving, coordinated group moving, communicating, and surviving together in one of Earth's most fascinating ecosystems. All carnivorous dinosaurs hunted prey. All right, let's talk about a myth that really messes with the classic image of dinosaurs, the idea that all carnivorous dinosaurs actively hunted prey. When most people picture dinosaurs, they imagine a massive T-Rex charging through the forest, jaws wide open, hunting down a hapless herbivore. Movies, books, and cartoons reinforce this picture. All carnivorous dinosaurs are hunters, predators to the last claw and fang. But the truth? Not every meat-eater was an active hunter. Some likely scavenged, relied on carrion, or combined both strategies depending on opportunity. First, let's break down why this myth exists. The iconic predators, T-Rex, Velociraptor, Allosaurus, have long dominated popular culture. They're dramatic, exciting, and cinematic. Predators fit the classic hunter's story. They chase, fight, and kill. But paleontologists study teeth, jaw structure, and fossil evidence, and the results suggest a more nuanced picture. Hunting requires energy, risk, and skill. Scavenging? Less risky, less energy-intensive, and still perfectly valid survival strategy. Nature doesn't demand that every predator be a relentless hunter. Take Tyrannosaurus rex, for example. Its massive jaws and bone-crushing teeth are perfect for hunting, but also excellent for scavenging. Fossil evidence shows puncture marks on bones from T-Rex teeth, sometimes on already dead animals. That suggests T-Rex wasn't picky. It could hunt, but it also took advantage of carcasses when available. In other words, T-Rex was likely an opportunist, combining hunting with scavenging depending on the circumstances. Not every bite required a chase. Other carnivorous dinosaurs may have relied even more heavily on scavenging. Large theropods, especially in environments where prey was scarce, could survive by feeding on dead animals. Even smaller predators could scavenge opportunistically, supplementing hunting with carrion to conserve energy. In modern ecosystems, many predators, like hyenas or foxes, also mix hunting and scavenging. Dinosaurs likely did the same. Being a meat eater doesn't automatically mean being a full-time hunter. Here's another clue: fossilized dinosaur trackways and stomach contents. Some theropods showed trackways consistent with searching behavior rather than pursuit. Fossilized gut contents sometimes reveal partially digested animals that weren't freshly killed. Together, these lines of evidence suggest that scavenging was part of the lifestyle for many carnivorous dinosaurs, even the fearsome ones. Hunting was important, but so was taking advantage of easy meals. Evolution favors efficiency, and scavenging is extremely efficient if you can find a carcass. Why does the myth persist? Mainly because hunters are exciting. A chasing T-Rex is cinematic gold. A T-Rex finding a dead Triceratops, less thrilling, even though it's equally valid. Movies and books love dramatic battles and chase sequences. They rarely depict a predator feeding on carrion because it doesn't make for the same edge-of-your-seat excitement. But science tells a more realistic story. Opportunistic feeding strategies were probably widespread. Even smaller carnivores like velociraptors may have scavenged occasionally. They were fast, agile, and clearly capable hunters, but there's no reason to assume they ignored easy meals when they appeared. Nature rewards flexibility, and dinosaurs were no exception. Being able to hunt and scavenge increased survival chances, especially in ecosystems with fluctuating prey populations. Here's a fun way to imagine it. Picture a T-Rex walking through a prehistoric plain. Its eyes scan for live prey, but it also notices a carcass partially eaten by another predator. Instead of wasting energy chasing something elusive, it walks over, rips into the meat, and fills its belly without a fight. Later, it might hunt a hadrosaur using speed and strategy. The point is, carnivorous dinosaurs weren't all-or-nothing predators. They were adaptable, opportunistic feeders. Even tooth morphology supports that. Some carnivores had serrated, curved teeth designed for slicing flesh, perfect for hunting. Others had broader, stronger teeth capable of crushing bones, ideal for scavenging. Certain species show evidence of both adaptations, suggesting a mixed feeding strategy. Dinosaurs, like modern animals, evolved tools to take advantage of whatever food sources were available. Another interesting twist: hunting requires risk. Prey can fight back, escape, or injure the predator. Scavenging reduces risk while still providing calories. For large carnivores, taking advantage of carrion is a smart survival strategy. Even apex predators today do this. Lions, hyenas, and wolves regularly scavenge. Dinosaurs likely followed the same logic. Evolution isn't about glory, it's about survival. In conclusion, the myth that all carnivorous dinosaurs hunted prey is too simplistic. Fossil evidence, jaw and teeth morphology, and ecological reasoning show that many meat-eaters scavenged opportunistically, combining hunting with carrion consumption depending on availability, energy needs, and risk. T-Rex, Velociraptor, and others were probably versatile predators, not relentless hunters. Next time someone pictures a T-Rex constantly chasing prey across the plains, imagine instead a dynamic, opportunistic predator, taking advantage of every chance to eat, survive, and thrive in a prehistoric ecosystem. Hunting? Yes. Scavenging? Absolutely. The dinosaur dinner table was far more diverse than you've been led to believe.
Dinosaur fossils are actually relatively common, but
fossilization is a highly selective process, and what survives isn't always representative of the past. Paleontologists have discovered thousands of dinosaur species worldwide, with hundreds of thousands of fossil specimens in museums, universities, and research collections. In North America alone, there are dozens of major fossil sites producing new specimens regularly. Places like the Badlands, Hell Creek Formation, and Dinosaur Provincial Park in Canada are literally fossil hotspots. So while it's dramatic to imagine a single bone turning up after decades of searching, in reality, paleontologists uncover fossils all the time. So why do people think fossils are rare? That comes down to the fossilization process itself. Most organisms decompose completely after death, eaten by scavengers, bacteria, or simply weathered away. For a fossil to form, very specific conditions must happen: rapid burial, low oxygen levels to slow decomposition, and mineral-rich environments to gradually replace organic tissue with stone. Even then, only certain bones, teeth, or shells fossilize well. Soft tissues like muscles, skin, and internal organs are almost always lost unless in exceptional conditions. This selective preservation makes it seem like fossils are rarer than they are. Another factor is geology and exposure. Dinosaurs lived across the planet, but not all areas preserve fossils equally. Mountain building, erosion, and volcanic activity destroy or bury many fossil sites. Only in certain sedimentary environments, river deltas, floodplains, or lake beds, do conditions favor fossilization. Paleontologists are also limited by where fossils are exposed at the surface or accessible through excavation. So yes, while fossils may exist in many places, actually finding them requires luck, skill, and sometimes expensive digging. And even when fossils are found, there is a selection bias. Larger animals like sauropods are more likely to leave fossilized bones because bigger bones are harder to destroy completely. Smaller animals, soft-bodied species, or those in environments not conducive to fossilization often leave little trace. That's why we have relatively few fossils of small, delicate dinosaurs compared to massive T-Rex skeletons. Fossil abundance is not just about rarity. It's about which bones and species survive the geological lottery. Interestingly, fossil-rich sites show that dinosaur bones can be abundant in some areas. Some ancient riverbeds or floodplains contain hundreds of individuals preserved together, offering incredible insights into entire populations. These mass fossil deposits suggest that while fossilization is selective, in the right conditions, bones can survive in astonishing numbers, sometimes representing generations of animals living in the same ecosystem. Another reason the myth persists is media portrayal. Movies and shows dramatize the excitement of discovery.
A single fossil can change everything. That's true in a scientific sense, but it also gives the impression that fossils are near impossible to find. In reality, paleontologists routinely find new specimens, sometimes even in urban areas or quarries. Fossils are out there,
It's just that the spectacular, complete skeletons we love to see in museums are far less common than isolated bones, teeth, or fragments. Soft tissue fossils add another twist. Until recently, paleontology focused on bones and teeth because those are most likely to fossilize. But discoveries of fossilized skin, feathers, and even remnants of blood vessels have challenged the idea that bones are all we have. Exceptional preservation sites, called Lagerstätten, occasionally give us snapshots of entire animals with soft tissues intact. These finds are rare compared to bones, but they remind us that the fossil record is richer than it first appears. It's just selective. Here's a mental image to illustrate. Picture a dinosaur dying on a floodplain. Scavengers take most of the flesh. Rivers wash some bones away. Weathering erodes others, and over thousands of years, minerals slowly replace the surviving bones. What you might find as a paleontologist is a single vertebra, a jawbone, or occasionally a nearly complete skeleton. The fossilization lottery is tough, but with enough patience and favorable conditions, fossils are relatively common, even if a perfect skeleton is rare. Another important factor is time scale. Dinosaurs existed for over 165 million years. That's an incomprehensibly long stretch of Earth's history. Even if fossilization only preserves a tiny fraction of individuals, the sheer length of time means we have a significant number of fossils today. The odds for a single individual are low, but the total number of preserved dinosaurs across millions of years is surprisingly large. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaur fossils are extremely rare is mostly a misconception. While fossilization is selective and complete skeletons are uncommon, fossils themselves, bones, teeth, tracks, and even soft tissue in rare cases are relatively common and have been found all over the world. The scarcity you often hear about comes from the combination of selective preservation, geological processes, and the rarity of fully intact specimens. So, next time someone tells you fossils are 1 in a million, you can tell them that the Earth is actually full of dinosaur bones. It's just a matter of knowing where to look, understanding geology, and being patient enough to uncover them.
Dinosaurs were dumb lizards. All right, let's dive into a myth that's been around almost as long as dinosaur movies themselves. The idea that dinosaurs were dumb, slow, lizard-like creatures with limited intelligence. If you grew up with old textbooks or classic films, you might remember dinosaurs portrayed as sluggish, brainless monsters. T-Rex lumbering aimlessly, Triceratops standing stiffly, and Velociraptor barely smarter than a lizard. But here's the kicker. That image is completely outdated. Dinosaurs were far more complex and intelligent than early depictions suggest, with sophisticated behaviors, sharp senses, and problem-solving abilities. First, let's talk about the brain. Early paleontologists assumed dinosaurs were dim because, compared to body size, their brains were smaller than mammals. But that's a misleading comparison. Brain size isn't everything.
brain structure matters. Modern research shows that many dinosaurs had well-developed parts of the brain responsible for vision, coordination, and sensory processing. For example, theropods like Velociraptor had enlarged areas for sight and smell, meaning they could track prey, navigate complex environments, and potentially communicate with each other. And speaking of Velociraptor, forget the tiny movie-fueled image. These guys were clever hunters, probably using strategy and coordination rather than relying solely on brute force. Fossil evidence of group behavior and complex hunting techniques hints that some carnivores may have worked together to corner prey. That's a level of intelligence and social skill far beyond dumb lizard territory. Even herbivorous dinosaurs weren't simple-minded. Triceratops, hadrosaurs, and ceratopsians show evidence of social structures, communication, and group living. Herding requires coordination, awareness of others, and learning social rules. That's sophisticated behavior. Like a herd of elephants or antelope today, dinosaurs needed to interact, communicate, and cooperate for survival. They weren't just moving dumbly through the landscape, they were making decisions, reacting to danger, and maintaining social bonds. They weren't just moving dumbly through the landscape, they were making decisions, reacting to danger, and maintaining social bonds. Sensory abilities also tell a story. Many dinosaurs had excellent vision, sometimes even color vision, which would help with spotting predators, finding mates, or identifying food. Some species had keen olfactory senses, suggesting they could track prey or detect danger from a distance. Hearing in some species was also acute. Combine these sensory abilities with brain structures adapted for coordination and balance, and you have creatures capable of complex interactions and rapid responses. Not exactly the image of a slow, stupid reptile. Another fascinating point. Some dinosaurs may have used tools or displayed problem-solving behaviors. Fossil evidence shows traces of complex nesting behaviors, careful arrangement of eggs, and even possible parental care. Think about that. Building nests, guarding young, and arranging eggs isn't random. It shows planning, memory, and adaptability. These are hallmarks of intelligence in animals. Even anatomy supports the idea that dinosaurs were clever. Birds are living dinosaurs, and many of them are extremely intelligent, capable of problem-solving, tool use, and communication.
If modern birds are any guide, their extinct relatives likely had similar potential. Raptors, for example, have brain-to-body ratios and behaviors that suggest keen intelligence and learning ability, comparable to modern corvids like crows or ravens. That's a far cry from the dumb reptile myth. So why does this myth persist? Movies, early illustrations, and old textbooks reinforce the idea of dinosaurs as slow, stupid, lizard-like creatures. Think about classic depictions: dinosaurs lumbering in swamps, blank-eyed, unthinking. It's dramatic and easy for storytelling, but entirely inaccurate. Science has since revealed a dynamic, intelligent, and socially complex picture. Dinosaurs weren't just big, dumb monsters. They were capable, adaptable, and clever in many ways. Here's a mental image. Picture a flock of small theropods hunting together. They coordinate movements, use cover, and anticipate the prey's behavior.
Or imagine a herd of hadrosaurs communicating through vocalizations, watching each other for danger, and leading younger individuals to safe feeding areas. Dinosaurs were constantly interacting with their environment and each other, solving problems and learning, behavior far more advanced than a simple cold-blooded lizard. Even T-Rex may have had surprising intelligence. Its hunting strategies, sensory abilities, and potential social interactions suggest a level of cunning and adaptability. Rather than a lumbering brute, T-Rex was a sophisticated predator, capable of making decisions based on context and opportunity. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaurs were dumb lizards is outdated and misleading. Fossil evidence, brain and sensory studies, nesting behaviors, social structures, and comparisons to modern birds show that dinosaurs were intelligent, perceptive, and behaviorally complex. They weren't just giant reptiles wandering aimlessly. They were active, clever, and capable creatures, navigating a dangerous prehistoric world with skill and awareness. So, next time someone imagines a slow, blank-eyed dinosaur, picture instead a sharp, responsive, and intelligent animal, constantly interacting with its environment and peers, making decisions, and surviving in ways far more sophisticated than we once thought.
All dinosaurs had the same posture. All right, let's dive into a myth that a lot of people probably haven't thought about. The idea that all dinosaurs had the same posture. For decades, classic depictions in movies, illustrations, and textbooks showed dinosaurs in stereotypical positions. T-Rex dragging its tail along the ground, Stegosaurus standing stiffly upright, or long-necked sauropods holding their necks like a parade float. It made it easy for artists and storytellers to portray them. But in reality, dinosaurs had incredibly diverse postures, and some species could even switch between bipedal and quadrupedal stances depending on what they were doing. First, let's talk about the obvious. Dinosaurs weren't all built the same way. Bipedal dinosaurs, like many theropods, including T-Rex, Velociraptor, and Allosaurus, walked on two legs. Their hips, legs, and tails were adapted for balance, running, and hunting. Their tails didn't drag behind like in old movies. They were held off the ground to counterbalance the head and body. That's why fossils and trackways show that many theropods could move quickly and gracefully, with posture optimized for speed and agility rather than lumbering awkwardly. On the flip side, quadrupedal dinosaurs, like sauropods or ceratopsians, were built to walk on all fours. Sauropods, think Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, or Apatosaurus, had massive bodies and long necks, and walking on four legs supported their enormous weight. Ceratopsians, like Triceratops, also used four legs for stability while grazing or defending themselves. Their skeletons, joints, and limb proportions clearly show a quadrupedal posture, contrasting sharply with bipedal theropods. So right off the bat, the idea that all dinosaurs had the same posture is busted. Here's where it gets even cooler. Some dinosaurs could switch between bipedal and quadrupedal postures. Certain ornithopods, like iguanodon, were primarily bipedal, but could walk on all fours while feeding or moving slowly. Fossilized limb bones and trackways suggest they shifted stances depending on context, much like modern kangaroos or bears alternating between walking on hind legs or walking on all fours. This versatility gave them an advantage, allowing them to reach food at different heights or navigate uneven terrain without sacrificing stability.
Even tail posture varied widely. Early depictions showed dinosaurs dragging tails like giant snakes behind them, but we now know that most species held their tails stiff and elevated off the ground. This wasn't just for balance, it also helped with agility, speed, and energy-efficient movement. Tail posture, along with limb positioning, varied depending on whether the dinosaur was running, walking, or standing still. Some tails were flexible, used for defense, communication, or balance, while others were stiff and rigid to support heavy bodies. The diversity in tail and limb posture alone shows that dinosaurs weren't one-size-fits-all. Let's also consider neck posture. Long-necked sauropods weren't all swan-necked parade walkers. Studies of vertebrae and muscle attachment sites show wide ranges of neck mobility, allowing them to graze low, reach high into trees, or scan their surroundings. Some dinosaurs had upright necks at rest, but could bend or twist depending on behavior. Others had rigid necks optimized for horizontal browsing. Neck posture was not universal, it was species-specific and behavior-dependent. Even among theropods, there's variety. Velociraptors had a horizontal, streamlined posture for running and hunting, while Spinosaurus may have had a more semi-aquatic stance for wading or swimming. Ankylosaurs, armored dinosaurs, had low squat postures to support heavy armor and defend against predators. Dinosaurs evolved postures tailored to their size, ecology, and lifestyle, not a single universal stance. So why does the myth persist? Classic dinosaur imagery from the early 20th century favored simple, recognizable silhouettes. Artists and filmmakers liked easy, repeated postures to help audiences identify species. Plus, many old reconstructions were based on incomplete fossils, making posture guesses prone to error. For decades, dragging tails, stiff limbs, and one-size-fits-all postures dominated textbooks and media. Modern research has completely reshaped that view. Here's a fun mental image. Picture a prehistoric scene with a T-Rex running across a plain on two legs, a herd of triceratops grazing on all fours, and an iguanodon shifting between walking upright to reach leaves and lowering itself to the ground for stability. Meanwhile, a diplodocus stretches its neck horizontally to eat foliage while its tail balances its massive body. That diversity of posture shows a complex, adaptable, and highly varied dinosaur world, not a single dumb lizard stance repeated over and over again. In conclusion, the myth that all dinosaurs have the same posture is completely wrong. Fossil evidence, trackways, skeletal analysis, and comparisons with modern animals show that dinosaurs had a wide range of stances, including bipedal, quadrupedal, and even versatile species capable of switching. Their tails, necks, and limbs were adapted to species-specific behaviors and ecological needs, making the prehistoric world far more dynamic than old textbooks or films suggest. Dinosaurs weren't the uniform army of lumbering beasts. They were diverse, specialized, and astonishingly adaptable in how they moved around and interacted with their environment.
Stegosaurus had a brain in its tail. All right, get ready for one of the quirkiest myths in dinosaur history, the idea that Stegosaurus had a second brain in its tail. If you've ever seen an old illustration of a Stegosaurus with a little brain bump over its hips or tail, you probably wondered how that could make any sense. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. This myth comes from a misinterpretation of the spinal cord anatomy, but it's stuck in pop culture for decades. Let's unpack it. First, here's the backstory. Stegosaurus had one of the most recognizable dinosaur silhouettes: a small head, large bony plates along its back, and that iconic spiked tail. Paleontologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries noticed that its skull was tiny relative to its huge body.
In fact, its brain cavity was extremely small, about the size of a walnut for a dinosaur that could weigh up to 5 to 7 tons. People naturally wondered, how could such a massive creature function with such a tiny brain? Then, scientists noticed an enlargement in the spinal canal over the hips. They assumed this swell was a second brain, a control center for its huge body and back legs. The idea made sense at first glance. The head brain seems too small. The body is enormous, so maybe evolution added a backup brain near the hips. This became a classic example in textbooks and museums, and for decades, the Stegosaurus had a brain in its tail myth spread widely. Here's where it gets really interesting. Modern science shows that this second brain wasn't a brain at all. The enlargement in the spinal cord was actually a glycogen body, a structure seen in modern birds. It's not responsible for thinking or decision-making. Instead, it likely helped with coordination of movement, especially for the hind limbs. Think of it as a sort of neurological hub that assists the main brain in controlling a large body efficiently. It's more like a traffic control center than a brain. Why did this myth persist for so long? Partly because of human intuition. We assume that a massive body must require a massive brain, and if the head can't do the job alone, evolution must have invented a second brain somewhere near the hips. Early paleontologists didn't have modern imaging techniques like CT scans, so they relied on size and shape. The tail brain was an easy explanation, even if it wasn't accurate. And of course, it made for a fun story. Kids loved imagining a Stegosaurus thinking with 2 brains. Let's also talk about the small head. Stegosaurus's tiny cranial brain wasn't actually a sign of stupidity. Brain size relative to body size is tricky. Birds, for example, have small heads but can be incredibly intelligent. Many functions like sensory processing, balance, and instinctive behaviors don't require enormous brains. Stegosaurus's brain, though small, was likely perfectly suited for its lifestyle, moving slowly, grazing on plants, and defending itself with tail spikes if necessary. It didn't need a massive brain to survive millions of years. Here's a fun image to picture. Imagine a Stegosaurus walking through a prehistoric forest. Its head is low to the ground, grazing on ferns. Its hind limbs move in a coordinated, controlled way, thanks to the glycogen body acting as a neurological assistant. Meanwhile, the tail swings defensively if threatened. No extra brain required, just efficient evolutionary design. Interestingly, the myth also reveals a bit about how science evolves. Early paleontologists made the best guesses they could with limited information. Later discoveries, better fossil preservation, and modern technology allowed scientists to revisit the anatomy and correct the misconception. This shows that science isn't static. It improves over time as we gather new evidence and refine old ideas. And it's not just Stegosaurus. Other dinosaurs were sometimes misrepresented because of similar misunderstandings. Anytime there's a strange enlargement in the spinal canal, it's tempting to assume it's a brain or unusual organ. Careful anatomical study, comparison with modern animals, and imaging have helped clarify many of these cases, replacing myths with evidence-based explanations. So what's the real takeaway? Stegosaurus didn't have a brain in its tail. The small head brain was sufficient for its needs, and the spinal enlargement over the hips was a specialized structure likely for coordinating movement. The idea of a tail brain is entertaining, sure, but it's more of a historical curiosity than science. And in a way, it makes Stegosaurus even cooler. It didn't need a second brain because evolution designed it perfectly for its environment. In conclusion, the myth that Stegosaurus had a brain in its tail is a classic example of a misinterpreted fossil feature turning into a widely believed story. Fossil evidence, modern anatomy, and comparative biology show that the tail brain was not a brain, but a coordination hub, and the tiny head brain was perfectly adequate for survival. Stegosaurus was a well-adapted plant-eating dinosaur, not a creature with 2 brains. This myth is a fun reminder of how science can be surprising and how our understanding of dinosaurs continues to grow with each new discovery.
T-Rex roared like in movies. All right, let's get into a myth that's probably burned into everyone's brain, thanks to Hollywood. The idea that Tyrannosaurus Rex roared like the monster in Jurassic Park.
That iconic, bone-rattling roar has been heard in countless movies, video games, and commercials, making us imagine T-Rex as a dinosaur with the vocal presence of a skyscraper-sized lion. But the truth? T-Rex probably sounded very different, more like low-frequency rumbles, hisses, or even deep-throated groans, rather than the cinematic roar we're used to. First, let's think about anatomy. The loud, high-decibel roars in movies are inspired by modern mammals, lions, tigers, or even elephants. But T-Rex wasn't a mammal. It was a theropod dinosaur. Its vocal anatomy would have been very different. Modern birds are actually the closest living relatives of dinosaurs like T-Rex. Birds don't have vocal cords like mammals. They use a structure called the syrinx to produce sound. Crocodiles, another distant relative, make low-frequency bellows or hisses. Combining this knowledge, paleontologists suspect that T-Rex may have produced deep, resonant sounds rather than ear-shattering roars. Evidence from fossils adds to the picture. While we can't hear an actual T-Rex, studies of skulls, sinus cavities, and possible vocalization structures suggest it could have made booming, low-frequency calls. Large air-filled spaces in the skull might have acted like natural resonators, producing vibrations that carried over long distances. Imagine a deep rumble, almost like distant thunder, rather than a screeching roar. These sounds could communicate warnings, attract mates, or establish territory without needing Hollywood-level volume. And here's the interesting part. Low-frequency sounds are actually evolutionarily useful. Deep rumbles travel farther than high-pitched noises, especially across forests, plains, or prehistoric landscapes. A T-Rex rumble could be heard for hundreds of meters, warning rivals or coordinating with a mate without revealing its exact location. In some ways, T-Rex may have been quieter, but more strategically vocal than the cinematic portrayal suggests. Movies also exaggerate roars for dramatic effect. The Jurassic Park roar, for example, wasn't recorded from a dinosaur. It was a creative mix of elephant trumpets, tiger growls, and alligator bellows. Sound designers wanted it to feel terrifying on screen. In real life, T-Rex may have been equally impressive, but not necessarily with the same ear-piercing drama. In fact, its actual vocalizations may have been low and subtle, effective for communication without alerting prey too early. Interestingly, scientists also compare T-Rex sounds to other dinosaurs and modern birds. Many birds make deep cooing calls despite being small. Extrapolate that to a massive dinosaur, and it's plausible that T-Rex could produce very low-frequency rumbles or hisses, maybe even felt through the ground as vibrations. That's terrifying in a different way. Your prey wouldn't hear a roar until the T-Rex is right on top of them. Fear, evolution style, not Hollywood style. Another fun point. Vocalizations may have been varied. T-Rex might have hissed or groaned in defensive situations, emitted low rumbles for mating calls, or even made short bursts of sound when interacting socially. Just like modern animals, it probably didn't rely on a single signature roar. It had a repertoire suited to its environment, size, and behavior. So why do we all picture T-Rex roaring like a monster? Pop culture, plain and simple. Movies need drama, sound effects, and memorable moments. A cinematic roar sells tickets.
Early depictions of dinosaurs in museums and media didn't emphasize subtlety or scientific accuracy. They emphasized terror and excitement. But science is catching up, replacing fantasy with probable reality. T-Rex was still awe-inspiring, just not in the exact way the movies show. Here's a mental image. Imagine walking through a Cretaceous forest. You feel the ground vibrate, not with a roar, but with a deep, rumbling vibration. You hear a low, resonant groan echoing from a distance. That's T-Rex communicating, asserting dominance, or marking its territory. You don't hear a dramatic roar like a Hollywood monster. You feel the power through low-frequency sound and subtle acoustic cues. That's real dinosaur intimidation. Less flashy, more scientifically grounded. In conclusion, the myth that T-Rex roared like in movies is just that, a myth. Fossil anatomy, comparisons to birds and crocodiles, and studies of skull structures suggest low-frequency rumbling, hissing, or groaning rather than bone-shattering, cinematic roars. T-Rex didn't need a Hollywood roar to be terrifying. It was massive, predatory, and probably communicated effectively in ways we can barely imagine today. So next time someone imitates a movie T-Rex roar, picture instead a subtle but powerful prehistoric rumble echoing through Cretaceous forests and plains, carrying intimidation in low-frequency sound rather than cinematic drama.
All dinosaurs went extinct in one day. All right, let's tackle a myth that's pretty dramatic. The idea that all dinosaurs went extinct in a single day, wiped off the face of the Earth in an instant. It's a story we've all heard. Asteroid hits, dinosaurs scream, ash covers the sky, and bam, gone. While it makes for a thrilling movie plot, the reality is way more complex. Dinosaurs didn't vanish instantly. They were victims of long-term environmental pressures, and the extinction event was a combination of catastrophic impact and ongoing ecological stress. First, let's clarify the timeline. Dinosaurs ruled the Earth for over 165 million years. That's an unimaginably long time. By the end of the Cretaceous period, around 66 million years ago, many species had already been under stress. Fossil evidence shows declining diversity in some dinosaur groups tens or even hundreds of thousands of years before the famous asteroid impact. So, by the time the asteroid hit, dinosaurs were already navigating a changing world. Climate fluctuations, sea level changes, and volcanic activity had been reshaping ecosystems. The asteroid didn't magically wipe out a thriving, uniform population. It hit an already stressed system. The asteroid impact near present-day Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula was certainly catastrophic. It released massive amounts of energy, triggered tsunamis, and ejected huge amounts of dust and debris into the atmosphere. That debris blocked sunlight, disrupted photosynthesis, and caused global cooling, a phenomenon called an impact winter. Plants struggled to survive, herbivores had less food, and the entire food chain was affected. But even then, extinction wasn't instantaneous. Many dinosaurs likely perished over months or years as ecosystems collapsed. It was a gradual die-off amplified by a single catastrophic event, not a single-day apocalypse. Volcanism also played a role. The Deccan traps in India were spewing lava, releasing gases, and altering climate long before the asteroid struck. Combined with the asteroid, these events created a perfect storm for extinction. Dinosaurs weren't killed by one thing. They were part of a complex web of environmental pressures that gradually eroded their ability to survive. Some species may have lasted longer than others, depending on location, adaptability, and ecological niche. Another interesting point: the fossil record itself can make extinction seem abrupt when it wasn't necessarily so. Sedimentary layers representing millions of years are often compressed in the fossil record. When we see a sudden disappearance of species in one layer, it looks instantaneous, but in reality, it could represent thousands or tens of thousands of years of decline. It's like flipping through a slow-motion movie. The one-day extinction is partly an artifact of how fossils are preserved. And here's a twist: not all dinosaurs went extinct. Birds are living dinosaurs. Modern birds descended from theropod dinosaurs, surviving the mass extinction event. That's right, dinosaurs aren't completely gone. Some lineages survived, adapted, and evolved into the incredible diversity of birds we see today. So even if non-avian dinosaurs vanished, the story is far from total annihilation. Why does this myth persist? Simple. Movies, books, and sensational storytelling love a dramatic narrative. Boom! One day, all dinosaurs gone. Makes it easy to understand and emotionally powerful. It's easy to visualize and terrifying, but it oversimplifies millions of years of ecological complexity. Nature isn't neat, and the demise of dinosaurs was no exception. Here's a mental image to make it clearer. Imagine a lush Cretaceous landscape with Triceratops grazing, T-Rex patrolling, and herds of hadrosaurs moving along rivers. Over decades and centuries, the climate shifts. Some plants die out, food becomes scarce, populations shrink. Then the asteroid hits. A massive cloud of dust darkens the sky, temperatures drop, and ecosystems collapse. Dinosaurs die off over months and years, not hours. Birds survive in small numbers, carrying the lineage forward. That's the real extinction story, slow, brutal, and complex. Interestingly, studying this event gives us insight into how life responds to stress and catastrophe. Mass extinctions are rarely instantaneous. They're the result of cumulative pressures. Dinosaurs teach us about resilience, adaptation, and the fragility of ecosystems. It's a nuanced story that's far more fascinating than a simple one-day wipeout. In conclusion, the myth that all dinosaurs went extinct in a single day is overly simplified. Fossil evidence, climate studies, and geological data showed that extinction was a complex, multi-stage process, influenced by asteroid impact, volcanism, and long-term environmental stress. While it may be tempting to imagine a single catastrophic event erasing every dinosaur in one dramatic moment, the reality was more drawn out, more tragic, and more scientifically interesting. Dinosaurs didn't vanish in a blink. They gradually succumbed to a changing world, leaving behind a legacy that still thrives in birds today.
Dinosaurs didn't care for their young. All right, here's a myth that might make some of us feel a little sorry for dinosaurs. The idea that dinosaurs didn't care for their young. You've probably seen the classic image in old books or movies. Baby dinosaurs left alone in nests, the parents nowhere to be seen, doomed to survive on their own. But fossil evidence tells a much different story, one that shows parenting and care in many dinosaur species, and it's honestly pretty fascinating. Let's start with the basics. For a long time, people assumed dinosaurs were like modern reptiles. Think lizards and crocodiles. In many reptiles, adults lay eggs and leave, and the babies have to fend for themselves from day one. So naturally, early paleontologists extended that idea to dinosaurs. Tiny hatchlings and fossilized nests seemed isolated, so the conclusion was drawn: no parenting, survival of the fittest, tough luck, little dino. But, as with many myths, the more we dug into fossils, the more the story changed. First, fossilized nests tell us a lot. Paleontologists have uncovered sites where adult dinosaurs were clearly tending nests. Some nests show eggs arranged carefully in patterns, sometimes in circular layouts, almost like the parents were arranging them for optimal incubation. That's not random, that's intentional care. Other nests have fossilized adult skeletons found right beside the eggs, suggesting the adults stayed close, possibly guarding them from predators or keeping them warm. Even more fascinating, tracks of juvenile dinosaurs alongside adults suggest that some species led their young around, like herds or flocks. Hadrosaurs, for example, seem to have traveled in groups with both adults and young. This implies a level of social organization and protection. Parents weren't abandoning their offspring. They were actively involved in raising and guiding them, helping them survive during the vulnerable early stages of life. Theropods, like the famous Maiasaura, provide some of the clearest evidence of dinosaur parenting. The name Maiasaura literally means good mother lizard, because fossils of nests and hatchlings showed that the parents provided food and care after the eggs hatched. Paleontologists found growth rings in juvenile bones, indicating that young dinosaurs grew rapidly, which would require consistent feeding and attention. The adults weren't just dropping eggs in a hole and leaving. They were nurturing their babies. There's also evidence of protection strategies. Some nests show multiple layers of eggs or carefully spaced clutches, possibly to reduce risk from predators. Fossilized trackways show that young dinosaurs were kept in safe areas away from immediate threats. In other words, dinosaurs developed strategies to ensure that at least some of their offspring survived, a far cry from the nature eats the weak image we often imagine. Even behavior inferred from fossilized bones suggests active involvement of parents. Rapid growth rates in many species indicate that hatchlings were fed and protected. Bones show signs of healed injuries in juveniles, suggesting adults may have defended them against predators. And some species may have even had vocal or visual signals to communicate with young, similar to how birds call the chicks today. Speaking of birds, remember this: birds are living dinosaurs. Modern birds show a wide range of parental behaviors, from feeding and brooding eggs to teaching young to fly. This evolutionary connection makes it plausible that parenting behaviors were present in non-avian dinosaurs too. It's not just guesswork, it's supported by a combination of fossil evidence and evolutionary logic. Why did the myths persist? Mainly because early discoveries were fragmentary. Isolated eggs or juvenile skeletons without surrounding adults were easy to misinterpret. Plus, the image of dinosaurs as cold, uncaring reptiles was reinforced by decades of textbooks, illustrations, and films. Movies love the idea of little dinosaurs struggling on their own, making the story dramatic. But paleontology is caught up, and the reality is much more nuanced and, honestly, way more interesting. Here's a fun mental picture. Imagine a herd of hadrosaurs moving through a Cretaceous plain. Adults keep a close eye on the young to make sure they stay together and don't wander into danger. Some adults might be standing near nests ready to defend against predators, while juveniles practice walking, feeding, and interacting. It's a busy, organized, and protective community. Dinosaurs weren't heartless. They were actively involved in the survival of their young. Even giant predators like some theropods may have displayed parental care. Fossils suggest some species stayed near young hatchlings or protected nests, even though these were dangerous and powerful animals. The idea that dinosaurs were all ruthless, uncaring creatures is oversimplified. In reality, many had complex social behaviors, including nurturing their offspring. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaurs didn't care for their young is completely busted. Fossilized nests, trackways, juvenile skeletons, and growth patterns show that many species actively cared for, protected, and even fed their offspring. Dinosaurs weren't just leaving their young to fend for themselves. They were parenting, socializing, and helping the next generation survive. So, next time someone pictures baby dinosaurs abandoned in a prehistoric wasteland, remember, their real story is far more touching and scientifically amazing. Dinosaurs were nurturing parents just like many animals today, ensuring their legacy lived on, not through neglect, but through care and protection.
All dinosaurs were fierce predators. All right, let's dive into a myth that's probably been fed to all of us by movies, cartoons, and classic textbooks. The idea that all dinosaurs were fierce predators, constantly hunting and devouring everything in sight. Picture T-Rex chomping through forests, Velociraptor chasing prey, and raptors leaping over rocks ready to eat. Dramatic, right? But here's the truth. Most dinosaurs were herbivores, and the predators were actually the minority. The all dinosaurs were killers image is wildly misleading. First, let's look at the numbers. Paleontologists estimate that roughly 70 to 80% of dinosaur species were plant eaters. That's right. Most dinosaurs didn't even need teeth sharp enough to tear flesh. Instead, they had flat teeth or specialized beaks for grinding and slicing vegetation. Huge sauropods like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus spent their days munching leaves and ferns, using their massive size to reach treetops and dominate feeding areas. Imagine a world where giant, gentle giants roamed the land, quietly stripping leaves from trees, while predators were relatively rare in comparison. Even herbivores had amazing adaptations. Many had armored bodies, spiked tails, or horns, not to kill other dinosaurs, but to protect themselves from predators. Triceratops, Ankylosaurus, and Stegosaurus weren't hunting anything. They were defending their plant-based meals from carnivores. Their fierce appearance is often misinterpreted as predatory behavior, when in reality, it's defensive evolution. Think about it. Huge tail clubs, sharp horns, and protective plates are perfect for survival against hunters, not for hunting. Carnivorous dinosaurs like T-Rex, Velociraptor, or Allosaurus definitely existed, and they were apex predators in their ecosystems, but they were outnumbered by herbivores. Predators needed prey, and ecosystems rely on a balance between hunters and grazers.
A world where every dinosaur was a carnivore simply wouldn't have worked. The population of herbivores supported the smaller number of predators. Predators were specialized, targeted, and often scavenged when opportunity arose, rather than constantly chasing every creature in sight. And here's another thing. Not all carnivores were huge or terrifying. Some smaller theropods were opportunistic feeders or scavengers, picking insects, small animals, or carrion, rather than actively hunting giant herbivores. Their role in the ecosystem was just as important, but it doesn't fit the all dinosaurs or monsters stereotype. The myth probably persists because movies and media love drama. It's far more exciting to see a T-Rex ripping through a forest than watch a herd of sauropods munching leaves. Illustrations, toys, and books reinforce the idea that dinosaurs are aggressive and dangerous, but reality was much more nuanced. Dinosaurs occupied a wide range of ecological niches, just like modern animals. Some were predators, some were prey, and many were peaceful plant eaters. Even the herbivores had fascinating behaviors that don't involve hunting. Herding, migrating, nesting, and defending against predators were all part of daily life. Brachiosaurus might have moved slowly but deliberately, reaching high for leaves, while hadrosaurs grazed in low vegetation in groups, using teamwork to protect themselves. Predators were a threat, yes, but the majority of dinosaur life wasn't about killing. It was about feeding, surviving, and reproducing. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a Cretaceous landscape. Towering sauropods reach up into trees, moving gracefully in herds. Triceratops graze near rivers, alert to T-Rex in the distance, but mostly going about their day. Small theropods scavenge and hunt insects. Carnivores exist, but they're a small percentage of the population. The majority of dinosaurs are peaceful herbivores, thriving in an ecosystem that balances predator and prey. It's a much calmer, more complex, and realistic scene than the all dinosaurs were killers image we often see. Interestingly, recognizing that most dinosaurs were herbivores changes how we understand their evolution and ecology. Their body size, social structures, and defensive features all make sense in the context of plant-eating lifestyles. Long necks for reaching leaves, elaborate horns and plates for protection, and herd behavior all point toward a world dominated by herbivores, with predators as occasional but crucial players. In conclusion, the myth that all dinosaurs were fierce predators is completely wrong. Fossil evidence, anatomical studies, and ecosystem modeling show that most dinosaurs were herbivorous, focused on feeding, protecting themselves, and reproducing. Predators were present, but they were the minority, specialized, and often not on the hunt. The next time you picture a prehistoric landscape, remember, it wasn't a continuous feeding frenzy. It was a dynamic, balanced world with the majority of dinosaurs peacefully munching leaves and only a few hunters stalking from the shadows. Dinosaurs weren't all killers. They were diverse, adaptive, and surprisingly peaceful in the grand scheme of life.
Dinosaurs couldn't fly. All right, let's tackle a myth that's been around for ages. The idea that dinosaurs couldn't fly. Picture the classic image of dinosaurs as huge, lumbering beasts. T-Rex stomping across the plains, Stegosaurus plodding along, and Triceratops grazing. Flying? Impossible, right? Well, hold on to your hats, because the truth is, some dinosaurs had wings and could take to the skies. And in fact,
birds are technically modern dinosaurs. That completely flips the all dinosaurs were grounded reptiles image on its head. First, let's talk about the lineage. Birds didn't just appear out of nowhere. They evolved from small theropod dinosaurs during the Mesozoic era. Fossil discoveries of species like Archaeopteryx, Microraptor, and Anchiornis show feathers, wings, and adaptations for flight. These weren't random evolutionary experiments. They were actual flying or gliding dinosaurs. Archaeopteryx, for example, had feathered wings and a long bony tail, showing a transitional form between classic theropods and modern birds. Feathers weren't just for flying, though. They initially evolved for insulation, display, or even balance while running. Over time, some species adapted these feathers for gliding and eventually powered flight. So, when you imagine dinosaurs, don't think of a rigid, scaly animal with no air mobility. Think of a world where feathers were common, and some species literally took to the air, using wings to hunt, escape predators, or move between trees. Microraptor is a perfect example. It had 4 feathered limbs, both arms and legs had wings, and could glide between trees. This tiny raven-sized predator shows that flight in dinosaurs was more complex than just bird-style wings. Some species were gliders, some evolved flapping flight, and some had feathered limbs for balance or display. Flight wasn't an afterthought. It was a successful survival strategy for certain dinosaurs. Even small feathered theropods, ancestors of modern birds, demonstrate that flight was a continuum. Some species couldn't fly like modern birds but could glide or parachute to escape predators or catch prey. Others had wings for display, mating rituals, or intimidation, similar to how peacocks use their feathers today. The myth that dinosaurs couldn't fly completely ignores this diversity of function and adaptation. Now let's talk about modern birds for a moment. Birds are living dinosaurs. That's right, every sparrow, eagle, or pigeon you see is technically a dinosaur. This makes the no flying dinosaurs myth not just wrong, it's literally false today. Birds are the evidence that some dinosaur lineages evolved flight successfully and survived the mass extinction 66 million years ago. Dinosaurs didn't disappear entirely. They just took to the skies in a smaller, feathered form. Why does the myth persist? Old textbooks and media often focus on the giant, ground-dwelling dinosaurs, the ones that grab attention in movies and museum exhibits. T-Rex, Triceratops, and Brachiosaurus are dramatic and exciting, but ignore smaller feathered aerial species. Plus, before the mid-20th century, paleontologists didn't have enough fossil evidence of feathered dinosaurs, so the assumption was that dinosaurs were all scaly and grounded. Modern discoveries have completely overturned that assumption. Here's a mental image. Picture a dense Cretaceous forest. On the ground, herbivorous dinosaurs graze. A small T-Rex or raptor stalks prey, moving stealthily through undergrowth. Above the trees, feathered Microraptors glide effortlessly between branches, wings spread wide. High overhead, early bird-like dinosaurs flap and soar, scouting for food or avoiding predators. Dinosaurs weren't just earthbound giants. They dominated multiple ecological niches, including the air. Even flightless dinosaurs had wings. Not all feathered species could fly, but their wings weren't useless. Some used them for display, mating, thermoregulation, or balance. Think about modern ostriches. They're flightless, but their wings are critical for social signaling and stability while running. Similarly, wings in some non-flying dinosaurs were versatile tools, demonstrating that flight, or wing evolution, wasn't simply a yes or no question. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaurs couldn't fly is completely busted. Fossil evidence, modern birds, and feathered theropods show that flight evolved in multiple dinosaur lineages, from gliding microraptors to flapping early birds like Archaeopteryx. Dinosaurs weren't just ground-bound reptiles, they were diverse, adaptable, and some literally took to the skies. Modern birds are living proof that dinosaurs didn't just dominate land, they conquered the air too. So next time someone says dinosaurs couldn't fly, just remember, you're basically looking at dinosaurs every time you see a bird flying above you.
Spinosaurus was land-based, like T-Rex. All right, here's a dinosaur that's been reimagined in recent years. Spinosaurus, often depicted as a massive T-Rex-style land predator stalking the Cretaceous plains. The myth goes that it was just another gigantic land-based hunter, chasing prey across rivers and forests. But science has flipped that narrative. Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic, spending much of its life in water, hunting fish and navigating rivers. This is one of the coolest shifts in our understanding of dinosaur lifestyles. Let's start with the basics. Spinosaurus lived about 100 million years ago in what's now North Africa, in a landscape full of rivers, lagoons, and wetlands. For a long time, it was reconstructed as a terrestrial predator because its skeleton was incomplete. Early fossils emphasized its massive jaws, sharp teeth, and towering sail, which naturally suggested a land-based T-Rex analog. Movies and books ran with this image, showing Spinosaurus roaring on dry land, fighting other predators, and dominating the plains. Then came more complete fossils and new analyses. Scientists noticed several adaptations suggesting Spinosaurus was built for water. Its long, narrow snout is very crocodile-like, perfect for catching fish. Its conical, non-serrated teeth are ideal for gripping slippery prey, not tearing through massive land animals. Even its nostrils are positioned farther back on the skull, allowing it to breathe while partially submerged, an aquatic feature modern animals like crocodiles also have. The limbs tell an even more surprising story. Its hind limbs were shorter than previously thought, unlike the long, powerful legs of T-Rex. This would make running on land difficult, but swimming much easier. Plus, its tail was later discovered to be broad and paddle-like, perfect for propulsion in water. Imagine a tail that acts like a natural oar, pushing Spinosaurus forward while it hunts fish in rivers. Suddenly, the idea of it as a land-bound predator starts to feel outdated. Evidence also comes from its environment. Fossils of Spinosaurus are often found alongside aquatic creatures, fish, crocodiles, and aquatic turtles, suggesting it lived in and around water. Its diet likely consisted heavily of fish, and isotopic analysis of its bones indicates that it spent a significant amount of time in freshwater systems. In other words, Spinosaurus wasn't prowling plains, it was gliding through rivers and hunting aquatic prey like a prehistoric crocodilian. Why does this myth persist? Mainly tradition and imagination.
For decades, Spinosaurus was one of the biggest, scariest dinosaurs in museums and media. It's much easier to depict it as a T-Rex analog, standing on two legs, towering over everything else, roaring dramatically. But science doesn't always conform to visual drama. The new semi-aquatic model is far more interesting and shows how adaptable dinosaurs could be. Here's a mental picture to make it clearer. Imagine a river winding through the Cretaceous landscape. Spinosaurus lurks beneath the surface, its long snout barely breaking the water. A school of fish swims by, and with a lightning-fast snap of its jaws, Spinosaurus patches its dinner. Its tail pushes it forward effortlessly, while its short legs keep it stable underwater. Occasionally, it hauls itself onto a riverbank or shallow area, but the water is its true home. This is not a lumbering land predator. It's a semi-aquatic hunter perfectly adapted to its niche. Interestingly, Spinosaurus challenges the stereotype that all giant theropods were strictly land-based apex predators. Dinosaurs weren't just big T-Rexes. They evolved a wide variety of lifestyles, including semi-aquatic hunting. This shows us that the dinosaur world was ecologically diverse, with species adapting to land, air, and water. Spinosaurus is a perfect example of evolutionary innovation, one of the largest predators ever, but one that didn't rely on dominating dry land like its relatives. In conclusion, the myth that Spinosaurus was land-based like T-Rex is completely busted. Fossil evidence, skeletal adaptations, and environmental context show that Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic, spending much of its life hunting in rivers, using its tail for propulsion and feeding primarily on fish. This dinosaur wasn't just a terrestrial terror. It was a water-loving predator, uniquely adapted to a riverine lifestyle. It's a reminder that dinosaurs were incredibly diverse, constantly surprising scientists and much more versatile than our old imagination might suggest.
Dinosaur skeletons in museums are real bones. All right. Here's a myth that surprises a lot of people. The idea that all those massive dinosaur skeletons in museums are made from real fossilized bones. You walk into a museum, see a towering T-Rex looming over you, and think, wow, those are the actual bones that roamed the Earth 66 million years ago. Well, not quite. Most dinosaur skeletons in museums are casts, composites, or replicas, and the story behind them is actually pretty fascinating. Let's start with why. Dinosaur bones are incredibly rare and fragile. Fossilization is a long, selective process, and even when bones survive, they're often cracked, incomplete, or too heavy to mount safely. Imagine trying to display a massive T-Rex skeleton with real bones. You'd risk breaking them every time the exhibit moves, or even if someone bumps into them. Real fossils are usually kept in climate-controlled storage to preserve them for research, not for public display. So how do museums make those jaw-dropping skeletons? Enter the magic of casts and replicas. Paleontologists create molds of actual fossil bones and then make casts from lightweight materials, like resin or fiberglass. These casts are almost identical to the real bones in shape and texture, but they're durable, easier to mount, and safe for visitors to see. In fact, many museum skeletons are made entirely from these casts, allowing scientists to reconstruct massive dinosaurs without risking the original fossils. Sometimes,
Skeletons are composites. That means they're a mix of real fossils and casts, or even bones from different individuals. For example, a single T-Rex mount might combine bones from several separate fossils to make a complete, impressive skeleton. Early paleontologists often did this to create iconic displays before enough complete skeletons were discovered. It wasn't cheating, it was a practical solution for education and public engagement. Even more interesting, some skeletons include fabricated parts. If a fossil is missing a limb or tail, paleontologists and artists can sculpt accurate replacements based on related species. That way, visitors see a complete skeleton without any gaps. These reconstructions are carefully labeled in scientific publications, but in a museum, they're often seamlessly integrated so the skeleton looks whole and lifelike. Why does this myth persist? Because when you look at a museum skeleton, it looks real. The size, the texture, the sheer presence, it's convincing. And most museums don't advertise which bones are real, which are casts, or which are reconstructed. For the average visitor, it feels authentic, so the assumption that all bones are real sticks. Movies, media, and documentaries often reinforce the idea, too, showing the actual dinosaur bones without context. Here's a fun mental image. Imagine a massive T-Rex skeleton towering over you. The claws, the skull, the rib cage, all perfect. But in reality, most of it is a carefully crafted replica designed to mimic the real fossils stored in the back rooms. The real bones might be smaller, broken, or incomplete. Scientists use the replicas to study posture, movement, and anatomy while keeping the originals preserved for research. In a way, you're looking at a scientifically accurate artistic representation rather than the literal dinosaur bones. There's also a bonus benefit to replicas. They can be touched, handled, or even displayed outdoors, which is impossible for fragile fossils. Some museums even allow kids to touch life-size T-Rex feet or dinosaur skulls that are replicas, giving a tactile experience without risking priceless fossils. This approach isn't new. Early paleontologists like Henry Fairfield Osborn in the 1800s and early 1900s used plaster casts to create the first complete dinosaur mounts. They often combined bones from multiple individuals or species to create full skeletons, and these mounts became iconic symbols of dinosaurs for the public. Modern museums have refined the process, but the principle is the same. Durability, safety, and accuracy often require using casts rather than fragile originals. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaur skeletons in museums are made entirely of real bones is completely busted. Most are casts, composites, or replicas, carefully designed to mimic the real fossils preserved in storage. The goal isn't to deceive, it's to allow visitors to experience the awe of dinosaurs safely and accurately, while keeping the precious originals intact for research. So next time you walk past a towering T-Rex or a giant Brachiosaurus, remember, you're seeing an incredible scientific reconstruction, combining artistry, engineering, and paleontology to bring these prehistoric giants to life, even if the bones themselves aren't real. Dinosaurs had no color. All right. Let's bust a myth that's been around for decades. The idea that dinosaurs had no color, that they were all gray or brown, like giant lizards walking through a dull prehistoric landscape. You've probably seen this in old textbooks or early dinosaur movies. Muted tones, dusty environments, and boring dinosaurs. But thanks to modern science, we now know that some dinosaurs were incredibly colorful, sporting vivid feathers or scales that would put modern birds to shame. First, let's talk about how scientists even figure out dinosaur color. For a long time, it was impossible. Fossils preserve bones, sometimes skin impressions, but color fades away over millions of years. That changed with the discovery of melanosomes, microscopic pigment-containing organelles in fossilized feathers and skin. By comparing the shape and density of melanosomes in fossils to those in modern birds, scientists can infer colors and patterns. Suddenly, dinosaurs were no longer just gray blobs. They had stripes, spots, iridescence, and bold patterns. Take Ankylosis, for example, a small feathered dinosaur from China. Fossilized feathers show it had a black and white body with a bright red crest on its head, essentially a prehistoric fashion statement. Or consider Microraptor, which had iridescent feathers that shimmered in sunlight, probably used for display or attracting mates. These tiny dinosaurs look like something straight out of a neon jungle, not dull prehistoric reptiles. Even large dinosaurs likely had color. Some evidence from fossilized skin suggests patterns or pigmentation, possibly for camouflage, thermoregulation, or social signaling. Imagine a herd of hadrosaurs moving to a forest. Some species may have had brightly colored crests or patterned skin to recognize each other or scare off predators. Color wasn't just for show. It had practical survival functions. Why does the myth persist? For one, early paleontology focused on bones, not skin or feathers. Museums and textbooks depicted dinosaurs as stone-colored skeletons because that's what was preserved. Movies and media reinforced this image. Giant gray monsters stomping through forests look dramatic and intimidating, but they ignore the possibility of bright, vibrant dinosaurs. Until fossil pigment studies became more common in the 21st century, nobody could definitively prove dinosaurs weren't just gray. Here's a fun thought experiment. Think of a modern forest. Birds flash colors for mating or camouflage, reptiles show patterns for hiding, and insects sport vivid tones to warn predators. Dinosaurs were part of these same ecosystems, evolving alongside these creatures. It makes sense that they too would have used color in similar ways, whether for attracting mates, signaling danger, or blending into the environment. The fossil record now confirms this theory for many species. Even some scaly dinosaurs, not just feathered ones, may have been colorful. Fossilized skin impressions suggest patterns or textures that could have supported pigmentation. So the stereotype of a gray, boring dinosaur simply doesn't hold up. It's based on outdated science and assumptions, not evidence. Color also tells us something about behavior. Display features like crests or vivid feathers suggest social complexity, communication, and even mating rituals. Dinosaurs weren't just brute animals. They were interactive, dynamic, and visually striking creatures. Understanding their colors gives us a window into their daily lives, just like studying bird plumage helps us understand modern ecosystems. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a prehistoric forest, alive with movement. Anchiornis darts among branches with a bright red crest. Microraptor glides, shimmering in sunlight. A herd of hadrosaurs grazing, their patterned skin helping them recognize each other from a distance. Even large theropods may have had muted but patterned skin to camouflage in dense foliage. This isn't a dull, gray world. It's vibrant, alive, and visually stunning. In conclusion, the myth that dinosaurs had no color is completely busted. Fossilized pigments, melanosomes, and comparative studies with modern birds show that dinosaurs were often vividly colored, with patterns and iridescence that could be used for camouflage, display, or communication. Dinosaurs weren't just gray, scaly monsters. They were dynamic, colorful, and visually complex creatures, painting a picture of the prehistoric world far more exciting than we ever imagined. So next time you think of a dinosaur, don't picture it as gray and boring. Imagine a creature bursting with color, competing, mating, and thriving in a bright prehistoric landscape.